Well, first thing is acknowledgement of country. So again, Monash University recognises and respects Indigenous Australians as the traditional owners of this land. We support Indigenous education, research and cultural awareness. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge and pay respects to the traditional owners and elders, both past and present, of the land on which Monash's 6 Australian campuses stand. Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, the Brave Kulin clan of the Gurung people. So we acknowledge their living culture and unique role in the life of the region and offer our deep appreciation for their contribution and support. Obviously very grateful to people for taking the time at a very busy time of year for everybody, but hopefully this will set up 2013 with some inspiration about a topic that we're all very passionate about. The opening words of welcome in the program, I think, capture that sense of passion, and these were penned by my colleague, my co-convener, Dr. Fay Patel. And one of the things I was inspired by in Fay's words is the sense of passion, which sadly is so often lacking in many areas of higher education today. And I think that's one of the reasons we're here today, because we're passionate about this particular facet of higher education. And looking at the PowerPoints, the presentation of the presenters, as well as Professor Shoemaker's presentation, I know that it's going to be a very exciting and engaging day for you. So without any further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Dr. Patel.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and thank you all for coming. As you know from the introduction in the program, it began as a conversation, and we're really thrilled that it's panned out to be a place where we can all meet together. As our presentations are going to be a short 20 minutes, we're going to work really hard to stick with it, so please bear with us if we run through some slides and stop and pause at others. So the reason I usually have a disclaimer is some of the material I use and some of the things I say might tend to be sensitive, and so that's why it's always upfront. And in the spirit of global engagement and creating spaces so that people are comfortable, I think it's necessary for us to make some of these things clear. The outline for today is just to touch on some of these issues, but also to highlight some of the critical aspects of global engagement and why creating spaces is it's not just the in thing and the label today, but it's why we need to commit ourselves to a broader higher education perspective, and how we need to bring ourselves and our learners together in the same places. So most important in the outline for me is opening spaces for dialogue, confronting history, the present and the future within a global engagement framework. And yes, not just my presentation, but I hope that today leaves us with more questions than answers. If that happens, then I think we've all successfully moved to the next level. So the global engagement framework, what do I think is really important in it, and what is it that I would like us to take away in terms of the broad picture? I think for too long it's been narrowly stuck in certain spaces, and we can all very quickly flick our minds to where those spaces are that the whole debate and discussion on global engagement gets stuck. I would like to see a more holistic perspective, one that incorporates the intellectual and emotional and active dimensions, but also the moral dimensions, so that learners and teachers can walk that space together and ensure that we have a well-rounded education that we're offering, but also a well-rounded global citizen that is out there who can deal with the issues as they arise. What then are some of the imperatives that I will speak about? I think dialogue is one of the most critical imperatives in a global engagement environment. And that seems to be missing today as a link in our over-enthusiasm about technologies and how we're all coming together at a faster pace. Dialogue is an imperative. Social responsibility and justice is almost the other side of what global engagement is all about. And most important, within this broad paradigm and framework is the need to build community and to actually move from awareness and consciousness to action and change. And I think those are some of the areas that are missing. We're all aware, we're all conscious, we're all passionate, but what do we do next? And I think today would be a really good time throughout the day at our tables and as we've been going through the lunch to talk about these issues. And okay, and these are the wonderful parts of technology, and we'll get back, I'm sure that's Mingsheng. New Zealand's like Joe is ahead of us, so they're always first. Some of the bold assumptions that I make in my presentation and that we need to make sometimes, I think, with global engagement is that we're all in it together. It's a collective rather than an individual action. It's a collective strategy. It's also, the assumptions I'm making is that we're all in it together for the common good. It's a selfless exercise. It's about sustainability. The other thing that needs to be said up front is that we also have to be concerned about the depth and breadth of the impact that we will have as educators, as teachers, and the learners would have as well on each other, on communities, and on groups and individuals, organizations. It's really quite deep, it's quite broad, and we need to acknowledge that. And I want to give you some examples of what I mean by impact. If we don't think about impact, then I think we're moving into global engagement almost at half-mast. With regard to curriculum innovation and creativity, I think global engagement really is the space that you can open up where you can put your passion into even subverting the curriculum to a point where you and your learners are critical about issues that you don't normally talk about. And if you can get them to talk about those issues and walk out again feeling uncomfortable or upset or angry or happy or joyful, then I think that's the global citizen we all want as our neighbor. So, what then does this global engagement framework encompass at the end of the day? Very quickly, some of the dimensions I mentioned have to be a critical part of this framework. We're not just educating for or educating or working with a learner or a global citizen or a citizen of the world who needs to be intellectual and have all the knowledge about things. We need that individual to have a moral dimension. He or she needs to know what responsibility and justice is. They need to know where's the cutoff point in terms of when they're crossing the line. They need to have an emotional dimension too. It's no good me saying I'm involved in global engagement and I stand out here and I don't engage with people and emotions and events in the way that it actually gets to my being. I need to be an active participant, and my mental and physical consciousness have to work together to show that I mean what I say and I'm actually doing something to bring about change. Within this holistic framework, I have adapted to Carnap's intercultural communication principles, and I believe that they are a very fundamental part of global engagement. And in paraphrasing some of those, I think you have to begin where you draw some mutually acceptable boundary lines. It has to happen in a forum such as this, in your classroom, in discussions about global engagement. You have to draw the lines, but they have to be mutually respectful. You have to reduce the uncertainty through negotiation. I don't know you, you don't know me. And for the moments that we meet in a teaching space, we need to be in a comfortable space where we are making people more comfortable in that space. And so if you go through that list, so all of those 10 principles have to be a fundamental part of global engagement. And we'll come back to some of these. What are some of the norms of engagement that we need to establish? Here are some that I generally offer classes and groups and participants, and I ask them what they think needs to be important as part of an open engagement forum. Because I want the classroom or the space to be safe, comfortable, and one in which people are inspired by what others do and say, but also to share what they have. So that's something to think about in a global engagement curriculum. This is another one. If all these clips are from the movie Mona Lisa Smile, it's a 2003 movie, you'll want to go perhaps and have a look at it. But this is another one which impacts on what sort of rules your global engagement classroom would have. So you might find something there that you would like to add. Moving on, what then are some of the critical issues that are facing us today in the 21st century university? We can talk for hours about these, but the points that I just want to make very quickly are that, first of all, it seems to be more and more recognized only today that we have a social responsibility to those whom we educate, and that social responsibility has been well given over the months and the years. So we need to engage with the whole issue of social responsibility and find out what it means to be socially responsible as an organization, as an institution, as an educator, and the person who is responsible for what learners learn. Along with the social responsibility and justice agenda, we need to be very clear about when we're going to have those conversations. I don't think we're having those conversations enough, and they're not taking place in our classrooms. And so we have different interpretations of what this means, and we need to perhaps reflect a little on that. Where does that conversation take place if not in the classroom? And if we're talking about responsibility and justice, for example, whose responsibility, whose justice, who decides, how do we bring it together? One of the things John Hudzik mentioned in an interview here in Queensland recently was that the university has a core mission, and we seem to have forgotten what that core mission is, and we need to be reminded. And basically he's talking about producing the citizen that can fit into the global context. But I looked at this whole issue of core mission, and I aligned it with all the other things we're doing already for the last decade in our classrooms. And we're doing a lot of this. We're doing less of core mission, we're doing more of Bloom's taxonomy, ILOs, and we're not aligning these things together to the point where we're asking ourselves, what are then those global engagement dimensions that we require? And I know I've stretched it a bit, I've exaggerated it a bit, but the thing is, if you take all our ILOs, SLOs, whatever you want to call them, Bloom's taxonomy, take your core mission and create that global dimension. If we can align those to the point where, again, the holistic framework of global engagement is going to be the critical issue, then we would have arrived there. If we're still somewhere between the ILO and Bloom's taxonomy, then I think we need to rethink where we stand. Again, the list of imperatives can go on, and you can add to this list as you wish from your discipline perspective, your experience perspective, your knowledge perspective. Two things that I want to pick up here very quickly, and I'm sure my time's nearly up anyway, is about building community and third culture, on what is sacred to all, learners and teachers. And from a communication theoretical perspective, family, religion, and history are absolutely the deepest forms of engagement for every one of us as we sit here. And we need to pick up on that in a global engagement curriculum. So, building community is not about finding out what the other culture does or knows, or what do I know about the other culture. It's about what do we have in common together, and what can we bring to the table that is enriching from each culture. And here I'm talking about the third culture theory that Li put together in terms of it inviting the richness of each culture, negotiating that richness, putting it on the table for the common good, and not talking about what's different and what's negative, which is what we've been doing a lot in the last 10 years on internationalization. So I also often talk about the global culture and about globalization, and it's really when you have come to a point where you think about global and local issues at the same time. that you can't think of one without thinking the other. And that's where all your social responsibility and justice dimensions come in. If I'm looking at the local community and how things impact the local community, I must at the same time, in the same blink of an eye, think of how it affects global communities. If I'm working with events that happen on a global level, at the same blink of an eye, I must think of how it impacts local communities. And the point about the deep cultural values within the communication theoretical framework is that if you had, Salva and Porter are the ones who actually brought up some of the research in finding out what are the beliefs and values that we hold dearest to us. And if you had to ask every culture in the world, what are the three main things you hold dearest to you, they will say it is love for family, for God, whatever form it takes, and country. And if you turn that around and ask yourself as you sit here now, why is it that we're all willing to kill and die for God, country, and family? We have something that's common to us all and that we can work with in a global engagement framework. What are the assumptions we're making? I've spoken about them, but I think also that I'm making an assumption that if you're not already there, you're willing to make a transition. If you're not about the common good, you start to think about it. If you're not working towards that goal, you will start to move towards it. There are various myths about what global engagement is, and I think the one I want to pick on is that it's really, on a curriculum level, people are assuming that global engagement means that, all disciplines will have the same needs and the same requirements. But the context of each discipline is different, and I think what we should really look for are creative solutions, not best practices, because they don't work for each discipline all the time. Impact. When I was talking about impact, the questions that are there are, will your freedom of expression infringe on the rights of others causing harm? So in a global engagement curriculum, we as educators and our students have to be asked that question. Will your right of expression infringe on somebody else? And if that happens, whatever harm there is, something that we need to think about. And how do we bring those things to the attention of our learners if we don't give them a space to talk about it, and if we ourselves do not interrogate what is happening out there? So these are some of the curriculum implications that we need to keep in mind. It's all very well trying creative things or trying different things, but impact of what we try, what we embed in the curriculum is important. And who takes responsibility for that? You as educator or the institution? Again, related to some of the comments I'm making about critical reflection on who we are as people, what values and beliefs we hold strongly, from communication theory, you'll find that we all carry with us stereotypes and prejudices. We all do at all times. Even now, as I stand before you, I am fully conditioned and programmed to be stereotypical and to have a prejudice. And it's some of this research that sometimes brings that up, and some of this research is dated, but it gets regurgitated, and all we then look for is, how do we put people into boxes? And that is going to impact how we design our curriculum. So some of us come from high context cultures and others from low context cultures. I bet some people didn't even realize that they were from one of these two cultures. But how do the models we carry reflect and impact the learners and the learning that takes place in our classroom? And what messages will our students go away with and then become media broadcasters and whatever they do on the media? And what will they take with them? That's important. So the question one of the questions that brings us to is, how does skin color, ethnicity, foreign language, accent impact teaching and learning design, delivery, assessment? Do we use different standards for different people because of accent and language? We need to think about it. Have we discriminated against anybody lately? Have you? I have, on a number of grounds. Has anybody discriminated against you lately? They have against me on a number of grounds. What do we do about it? Where do we talk about it? We need to think about it. And I believe that we need to confront history, we need to confront the present, and we need to confront the future. We need to use what's critical to our local social engagement that makes us think about what we want as the common good for others. And I wanted to point this out to you. If you take some of the news clips that came out of the Sydney riots of September last year, you'll find a difference in how it's reported, who's reporting it, what they're saying, how they're saying it. At the same time, you might also have heard of the Latrobe student protests. Again, when students finished their wonderful protest, they said, this is what democracy looks like. The question is, whose democracy? What's happening here, and how do we correct that? I want to close with 2 quick slides. This one about examples in how global engagement can be embedded across the curriculum. It's an exercise I was part of in Canada almost 10 years ago, but we used global engagement through video conference technology. 3 key topics: HIV/AIDS challenges in South Africa and Canada, exchange of researchers thinking and talking about it. Second one was American football and the European sports space, kinetics, human kinetics discussion. Another one was the global clean water. And then research-based assignments, a critical examination of workplace violations in terms of human rights principles of the state or the province. And students had to do a research assignment on it. Examination and analysis of the branding clothing we're all wearing. And the third one was an investigation into the history and the use of derogatory labels and the effect it has on people. So those are the kind of things that can run across disciplines, across faculties, and we need to think about it. And so I'll close with this last slide, that I do believe that we can make a difference and that we can broaden global engagement to include some of those fundamental imperatives that I spoke about. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, so it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Mingsheng Li from Massey University in New Zealand. He's a great colleague of mine at one time when I was in New Zealand, and he's a very good friend and co-author of the book that we wrote together a year ago on building global communities and intercultural communication. Without further ado, Mingsheng, it's over to you.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm very pleased to be back to Melbourne again, where I stayed for 4 years doing my PhD from 1995 to 1999. So I left Melbourne about 13 years ago. I'm very pleased, I'm very much honored to participate in the symposium. The symposium itself clearly shows that higher education internationalization is gaining increased attention. Now, in my presentation today, I'm going to share with you our understanding of the notion of higher education internationalization, the concept of global citizenship, the importance, approaches, and the practices of internationalization of the curriculum. Finally, I will mention some of the key challenges in the process of internationalizing the curriculum. We all talk about internationalization and globalization and use the term, these 2 words interchangeably. However, Jane Knight, a Canadian researcher, found that they are not the same. To her, globalization is unintentional, but internationalization is intentional. Internationalization shapes our higher education policies and strategic priorities. She says, internationalization is changing the world of higher education, and globalization is changing the world of internationalization. Internationalization has become a buzzword in higher education. It is a sign of world-class universities. It is associated with the university's reputation, branding, ranking, and world-class status. It has become an indispensable part of university's mission statement, vision, goals, strategic priorities, and policy guidelines. We all talk about internationalization of higher education. However, different universities in different contexts interpret internationalization differently. For some universities, reputation, branding, and economic benefits are the goals. But for some other universities, it means Americanization, or Westernization, or Europeanization. For example, China has tried very hard to strengthen its higher education by borrowing or imitating Western higher education models. If you look at these pictures, you might wonder if they are in Europe. Interestingly, they are not. They are in China. Shanghai International Studies University has internationalized its campus by copying European architectural styles. A Google search shows that almost all major universities in the world include internationalization as one of the strategic priorities in the mission statements. For example, Massey University, La Trobe University, and also my university, that is Massey University, they have included the three keywords in their mission statements: international, global, and the world. Massey University, like La Trobe University, and also Monash University and other Western universities, has made great efforts to internationalize the university, the programs, and also curricula. Massey University has enrolled around 4,000 international students every year, approximately 12% of the total student population. For example, the College of Business, where I'm looking, has established a number of bilateral relationships and training programs with more than 20 leading universities in the Asian Pacific region. The types of the training programs include 2+2 undergraduate programs and 1+1 postgraduate programs. We also have lots of staff exchange programs with universities in other parts of the world. Universities can play a critical role in internationalization and in educating global citizens as a workforce and as future leaders with regards to universities' knowledge creation, production, dissemination, management, and application for the benefits of local, regional, global countries. Now let me move on to the concepts of citizenship and global citizenship. Citizenship refers to membership of a nation state or supranational organizations such as the European Union in terms of civil, political, social rights, liberties, duties, status, and power. It is forged exclusively. Citizenship is celebrated where the political civic dimensions of life in the nation state. It means the status, the equal citizenship of a particular nation. However, individuals also exist within other dimensions, economic and social dimensions, and they have various roles and responsibilities. They are all rooted at both the local and the global levels. Therefore, the term global citizenship is more appropriate to cover all of these dimensions. Nation-state citizenship is established many ways by globalization, such as both of goods, people, ideas, and technology. The concept of nation-state citizenship is no longer compatible with the economic, social, cultural, geopolitical developments in the world. In almost all countries, there are many non-citizens living, studying, traveling in the host country, such as international students, tourists, new immigrants who are not citizens, seasonal or guest workers, and visiting academics, and so on and so forth. Rhodes and Zeleny proposed 4 types of citizens situated in 4 quadrants, 2 anti local and global, individual and collective. Type 1, locally informed collectivists. Type 3, locally informed individualists. Type 4, globally informed individualists. Type 2, global citizen, is relevant to my topic today. Universities are expected to support the development of globally informed collectivist citizens and to promote globally oriented citizens among students and the faculties. How do we define the global citizen? A global citizen is defined as a member of any local, national, regional, and global community that is based on the principle of equality, justice, fairness, responsibility, and commitments. A global citizen respects and values cultural diversity and differences. A global citizen also appreciates interdependence of peoples across cultures, borders, and religions. A global citizen is interested in the issues and the problems of global concerns. However, the global citizen does not have rights and the privileges a national citizen can enjoy. He or she does not owe any allegiance to any global government. That does not exist at all. To internationalize higher education and to educate global citizens, it is important to restructure, recontextualize, and redevelop the curriculum. Internationalizing the curriculum is considered to be the most important part of higher education in internationalization. It is an integral part of any process of internationalization in higher education. It involves curriculum development, teaching pedagogy, assessment, educational philosophies, value systems, managerialism, and professional development. 9 approaches to internationalizing the curriculum are proposed here. The ethos approach is to create a campus culture or an organizational culture with international orientations. The graduate attribute approach emphasizes the importance of employability, occupational skills, and experience. The mobility approach involves exchange programs, mobility of students and faculty, branch campuses, cross-border collaborative arrangements, and the training programs, and so on and so forth. The content approach includes international perspectives in the curriculum. The competency approach is to develop students' competencies, skills, values, ethics, multi-literacies, and attitudes. The add-on approach is to add new international content from other cultures in the curriculum. The infusion approach is to create a new space for international perspectives and integrate more diverse content into the core fabric of the course. The transformational approach will lead to changes in faculty and students in fundamental ways, in how they think about the world, and change the hegemonic discourse and ethnocentrism in the curriculum. The last one, the interdisciplinary approach, is to expose students to different disciplinary knowledge domains and methods of inquiry and investigation. Internationalizing the curriculum calls for pedagogical changes in the following 8 dimensions. It is important to make the curriculum relevant to the life of both domestic and international students, and to systematically integrate international perspectives into the curriculum, strategies, and policies. It is also important to use learning materials, readings, case studies, examples, and research projects that contain international perspectives in the learning process. Students should be provided with opportunities to participate in internationally oriented activities, including OEE, internship, and volunteering. We need to prepare students to engage with differences and global issues such as sustainability, equality, and justice. Students and academics should be encouraged to challenge familiar and typical practice, norms, values, and beliefs. Universities need to establish links with partner universities overseas and develop exchange programs or joint degree programs, such as training programs I mentioned earlier. Above all, it is important to strike a balance between domestic and international content in developing the curriculum, pedagogy, learning outcomes, and assessment. There are many challenges in internationalizing the curriculum in higher education. These challenges are shared by many universities around the world. However, such challenges, once identified, can be resolved with determined commitments from academics, management, students, and stakeholders. They should not help us. These challenges currently internationalizing is more rhetoric than reality. It lacks shared understanding, strategic directions. It doesn't have a clear definition, systematic planning, and policy. It lacks real objectives and learning outcomes. It still remains random individual experimentations rather than coordinated collective actions. Not all academics are aware pedagogical and theoretical implications of higher education, internationalization, and internationalized curriculum. The internationalization scope has not been institutionalized and has not been embedded in the curriculum. There exists a hegemonic part of teaching pedagogy which is difficult to change. Finally, internationalization in higher education and internationalization of curriculum to educate global citizens call for immediate action. Can we afford that? In summary, internationalization has gained and increased attention from academics, researchers, and university senior management. Higher education is morally responsible for educating students to become global citizens and to enact their responsibilities in local, national, and global contexts. It is an imperative to integrate international perspective into the curriculum. And systems thinking is needed to combine universities' policies and strategies, graduate attributes, curriculum development, learning outcomes, teaching pedagogy, assessment, and the faculty's involvement and participation to achieve desired goals. Thank you very much.
Firstly, thank you for the opportunity to present. I think the variety in the topics in the speakers, not surprisingly, has a hidden connection underneath. And I just think it's healthy for me to even reflect on the first two speakers so far to help contextualise what I'm going to talk about. It was really valuable to hear Dr. Patel talk about engagement in the classroom of material for me that comes from outside the classroom. Because essentially, in talking about mobility today, I'm going to talk about experiences that come from outside the traditional classroom space. And then, just building on what Dr. Li has identified for you, the notion of that internationalisation hasn't been institutionalised yet. Again, coming from where I come from within the mobility sphere, that's very much a frustration or a discourse that we're continually engaged in, is that we at times don't feel that we're institutionalised within the internationalisation that goes on within the higher education sector. So I think it's healthy to actually get a little bit more understanding of where I fit within this picture today, and certainly where I come from. So I work within the Monash Board office at Monash University, and we're responsible for all of the students who are not full degree students. So if you come to our campus as an international student for a short stay, or if you leave our campus for a stay anywhere up to a year as part of their degree program. So in being asked to come and present today, what I deliberately tried to do was pick something slightly provocative that gives you a sense of where mobility might fit into an internationalised agenda and what the future role for mobility might be. You'll notice that I'm using the word mobility to start with. I'm going to interchange with exchange and mobility just briefly, and then give you some definitions as we move on. Firstly, I'd just like to show you a little bit. Just like to share with you a little bit of where mobility sits within the Australian context. So everything I'm going to talk about today emanates, or the starting point is in fact from the Australian sector. So within our work area, we report annually into a process that's run by the Australian University's International Directors Forum, AUIDF, and this is just some of the statistics that will actually show the growth in mobility, remembering that mobility is not full degree students. What I'm not talking about today, and what are not reflected in these figures, are students who come to take their 3, 4 or 5 year full degree as an international student. There's so much that you perhaps need to understand behind these figures to give them context. So I want to pick out two particular aspects to start you on the journey or the story today. First is the total, which obviously tells a story in itself. In 2007, just over 10,500 Australian students left Australia for some form of international experience as part of their Australian enrolment program. 4 years later, that figure had doubled. Now obviously within that, you need to take in context the rise in university admissions, and so that 95% perhaps doesn't look as grandiose when you place that in there, but it's still quite dramatic exponential growth. So in 2011, the figures that we reported on last year, that had risen to almost 21,000, so almost 100% increase in numbers going out. There's two aspects of what I'm going to talk about today, and the title of the presentation gives it away in being beyond exchange. That I want to look at the exchange figure here, and then I also want to look at short-term programs and placements or practical training. Exchange has risen from just over 5,000 to just over 7,500. So in the context of this whole picture, a rather modest increase of 37%. And so what I want to talk about as we move along is some of the difficulties around exchange and perhaps why it hasn't grown in the same way that we would have predicted. The other two there that have growth rates of 194% and 224%, I think not surprisingly, are based around short-term programs, so programs that are under 8 weeks in length, and programs that are either emanating or generating from within faculties or have a direct attachment to the students' core enrolment. So as an example, this might be a physiotherapy student who takes a placement from the Solomon Islands. It might be a medical student on placement at an international hospital. It might be a teacher who's on teaching placement in South Africa, where the international experience has a direct relationship to the course that they're undertaking. I just want to pause to give the point of distinction here, in that for the majority, not all, but for the majority of exchange experiences, the selection of the university, the selection of the country and the region need not necessarily have a strong correlation with the student's undergraduate and postgraduate program. And that's an important point to remember, because I'm going to come back to that in the next 10 minutes to show perhaps why exchange hasn't been the holy grail of internationalised mobility that many universities might have perceived it was going to be 10 years ago. So, some historical context for exchange. Again, speaking from the Australian perspective. Because within exchange we don't necessarily deal in dollars, anything that doesn't deal in a dollar automatically seems to strike lower on the totem pole of importance. I think I'm not incorrect and unfair in espousing that in any higher education environment. So as a result, students coming in for short-term experiences or going out for short-term experiences where there is essentially no dollar exchange automatically becomes a poor cousin in a commercialised environment where full-degree students bring in thousands of dollars. So historically, exchange hasn't been seen as a high priority within universities. Again, I'm speaking relatively. There are other things that certainly fall below us, but there are many things that rise above us. Historically, exchange has been based around agreements with other universities, and I want to try and land a small analogy here. Many of the agreements, from my personal perspective, and certainly in one of the processes that we've undertaken at my institution just recently, many of the agreements have little to no basis behind them. They were formed in what I would very politely describe as an old gentleman's lunch. People who were perhaps familiar, both professionally, academically and socially, and felt that their universities might like to undertake some collaboration and business. Now, I'm going to be very clear. It's not to say that that can't then lead to very successful collaborations, but when that perhaps is the primary and the only starting point, it often makes some of the mobility products that we need to deal with very hard to operationalise. I had a slightly quirky thought, which is not supposed to be funny, but might give you a sense of the frustration that people in my field experience. Is that I'm sure in 10 or 15 years, archaeologists may well dig up exchange agreements back from the early 2000s and will realise that mobility officers were actually the first pioneers in social media, because we actually friended people just for the sake of friending. And that's what many exchange agreements essentially were. I met you, we spoke for 5 minutes, you seemed kind of nice, you're somewhere outside Australia, let's exchange some students. So I think we were the first people to really friend people back in the early 2000s. What's starting to happen, and I think that reinforces that, is that many universities are going through perhaps a slightly embarrassing process, if we're honest, that we're starting to remove ourselves from some of those arrangements that haven't necessarily unfolded in the way that we might have liked them to unfold. And again, you'll see as I start moving through in the next 10 minutes, we've developed perhaps a stronger sense of strategy or a reasoning behind our partnerships. And where we have kept exchange models growing, we're actually adding other aspects to the mobility experience into them, making them, in a sense, deeper relationships. As a result, if you go back to the first 2 points I've made, many exchange relationships, in a sense, became misaligned, if in fact they ever were aligned with the university strategy. So historically, when you look at many mobility officers, they often sat out as an outpost of full-degree recruiting and marketing, and because they had perhaps little political legitimacy within the hierarchy of the university, they really had no space with which to be both pushing their point and to take their direction from. So as a result, this often led to that proliferation of exchange agreements where mobility officers and other staff were allowed to essentially run off and say, yes, we like you, so let's sign and move on. that reflects my next point, that we really pursued quantity. It was all about being able to say on our international websites, so when university websites in the mid-2000s started having these global profiles or large international profiles, it was a lovely statement to say that we had partners across 35 countries and 224 institutions. That became, in a sense, the pursuit or the KPI, rather than what the student took from that experience, what the staff took from that experience. It was essentially numbers-based. Unfortunately, or fortunately, because it certainly has helped our development, what played out at the same time was that this was a new area, exciting for students, exciting for staff, so it took off exponentially. The opportunity, of course, to go and spend 6 months at a German, French, UK, Scandinavian, American, Latin American institution, of course, to an undergraduate student is a magnificent aspect of adding something into their degree. Now, students would obviously look at it slightly differently. It led to other travel aspects, chances to go and formulate family reunions across Asia, certainly from the Australian context, that colonial context of going back to the UK. So there was lots of drive and push. Universities became, in the early 2000s, very heavily funded by government and certainly invested a lot of their own money in trying to shift students out. Not to say that money is the sole driver, and I personally believe that money is only one aspect of students out, but the government has devised and delivered a very clear agenda around funding that's actually encouraging students to go out through two schemes. One very much around scholarships given to students to fund their outbound mobility, and secondly, a very, very large loan scheme that basically goes back into their expat as well to assist in outbound mobility. The last part, which will be very interesting to hear once we come back to the panel discussion, but my sense is that there's been an ongoing discourse, but lack of progression around the merging of the academic aspects of the exchange experience and the administration of the exchange experience. So certainly the team that I work with, we have an ongoing, I'll use the word frustration, but I'm meaning it in a very polite, respectful sense, of working to balance what the university's agenda is and then individual agendas that come out of each of the faculties as well. That can be quite a difficult thing to manage. Certainly, in going back to that 250 exchange agreements, some of those have directed from the VC, some of them have directed from one particular academic who might sense that students within their course want to go to a university that they have a research relationship with. So balancing the priorities of those can be quite a difficult process. So that's some of the complexity around the history of exchange. And so what I'm, I guess, trying to propose or put in your mind today, and happen to be challenged when the panel comes forward, is that maybe exchange was never the best model, and certainly shouldn't be the only model in a way of giving students an internationalised experience. Now, I'm going to put a caveat around that, and I'm not proposing in any way that exchange should go away. I think it has a strong place, but it requires some maturation or further development. So where is exchange now? I guess part of the picture I've tried to promote is possibly going back around 10, 11 years ago. So what does it look like now? I think it's still a relatively new phenomenon. In higher education, just because you've been around for 13 or 14 years certainly doesn't give you any sense of firm and established territory. And in a sense, exchange remains fairly well unchanged. And I'm putting a level of homogeneity across it that probably doesn't acknowledge there are pockets of best practice and unique programs out there, but as a principle, exchange remains unchanged. It's essentially the student decides that in the second semester of their second year of their business economics course that they want to go and do 6 months at Leeds University in the UK. That's essentially what exchange is. What, for me, unpacks out of that is that we still pretty much deliver a transactional product. Now, I've got several of the staff from our area here, so again, I say this with all respect, is that we administer and spend a lot of time and energy investing in setting up that experience, but to a certain degree, that's where our academic and university engagement potentially ends with that student. So I'm not sure that we actually add any value apart from allowing the student to be somewhere else. And I wonder whether there needs to be some structure, some direction, or some other way of supporting what happens during that time that they're away. So for that reason, I don't think we contribute as strongly as we might to the transformation of the student during that time. And so part of my first little challenge is that if we're not offering the chance to have a transformational experience, then I really don't think we should be offering it at all. We should be looking at changing it. For that reason, I still think Exchange is quite a strategically immature product. It's very student-centric, and that's not to say we shouldn't be focusing on students. What we're hearing a lot about today, I think it's two themes, internationalisation and the student experience. So we should be aimed at students. What I guess I'm starting to propose here that there should be a value add not just for the student, but also for the faculty member, for the faculty as a whole, and for the university and for the education sector as a whole. So I think Exchange has become almost perhaps a very selfish part of internationalisation, where all of the benefit is actually packaged in and pushed towards the student. So I'm not sure that the university generates the value, and not just the dollar value, but perhaps there's other research collaboration that goes alongside that. I'm not sure universities have tapped into the strategic value that exchange relationships might bring. And so you can see how the story unfolds, but when you have 250 exchange relationships, to get depth within those, it's very difficult compared to having a set of 80 exchange relationships where you can get better vertical and horizontal integration. So I think we still sit, and one of my ongoing challenges on the weekend and at night is thinking, how do we actually push, engage, or further sit within the student experience and the academic experience more, and attempt to bridge that nexus between teaching and learning and administration. Sometimes it seems to be that we just administer or allow that opportunity to take place. I'm not sure that we, as mobility practitioners, really understand how we should be bringing more of the academic domain into that experience. Because otherwise, again, it's essentially just a student going somewhere else to take 6 months of their course. It's an incredibly, and I say this with absolute respect for our team of staff, it's an incredibly resource-intensive product, incredibly intensive. And I know I'm speaking to a room that has a number of reasonably senior academics in it, and what I would ask for you to understand and take away is that when you see a student go away on exchange, the length of work, both emotionally and time and financial investment that goes into getting that student away, again, I'm not sure that we then drag the value back out of that. So there's two ways of looking at it. I don't think it's transformational for the student, and I don't think it returns any value to the university. And so for that reason, I think we need to come to a forum like this and just ask ourselves the question that how do we transform the student or offer them the opportunity to transform? And how do we extract value back out of it for the university? Okay, so what's the future for exchange and what might it look like? So again, I go back to my previous comment. In short, yes, I absolutely believe there's a future for exchange. It will just be another part of a broader suite of mobility products that we offer students. So having said yes, what does it need to look like? Less partnerships. We're obsessed with the number. We need to get rid of the number. We need to be proud to say that we have 50 exchange agreements and then talk about the quality and the outcome of what happens within those agreements. I don't want to have to keep going to forums and be told that the way of expressing how successful I am is that I have 250 agreements across 35 countries. That actually doesn't deliver an outcome for the university, and I don't think that in itself transforms the student. What that does is it gives me an opportunity for greater alignment with strategy. Just as an example from my own institution, we have some wonderful opportunities falling out of the very depth alliance that we have with Warwick University at the moment. And so as an example of a partnership, an exchange relationship that sits within a broader institutional alliance, it's a much more exciting place to work. The students have a greater suite of opportunities. There's a sense of an investment now actually keeps returning semester after semester, and that actually gives value for the student, for the staff, and for the university as a whole. I spoke about vertical and horizontal integration. The next two, I think, go together quite well. We would love to work more with faculty members to look at how to actually build mobility experiences so that they actually become ingrained, and I don't want to use the word compulsory, but I guess that's probably where I'm going. How we actually offer up opportunities where mobility just becomes subsumed or an axiomatic part of the course that students enroll in. There's wonderful opportunity around industry and community consultation. So the growth area, if you think back to the chart that I put up first, is around internship and volunteer opportunities. And then something that we're working on a lot at Monash at the moment is attending to or trying to give greater resource and investment of time to I've written pre, during and post-exchange, but I'm going to qualify that and say the pre and the post. The during is also an aspect where we should be engaged with students reflecting on what they're learning and the differences that they're uncovering about their core degree of study. But an absolutely untapped area, particularly in Australia, is working with the students who prepare them for that experience, almost preparing them for how to learn from being on exchange. And then a post-experience, which is twofold. It's about debriefing that experience, but then also leveraging from that experience. How do I write about that experience in my next essay or in my next lab experiment? So using that international experience for the rest of their degree program. So the second part that I just want to finish on, got a minute to go, is just to raise the notion of non-credit-based mobility, which is a bit of a hidden aspect of mobility, particularly within Australia. Again, I've taken the figures deliberately from the same two years that I gave you earlier, but this is reporting to the International Directors Forum on students that undertake mobility through universities where the mobility is not for credit. And I'm raising this because this is an area where choosing to profile and actually promote that Monash in 2013. And I just thought it would give you a sense of how underreported this is. I just want to finish on this statistic, that in 2011, this indicates that across the institutions that contributed to this report, they reported 33 students per institution in Australia. Now, I know from our records management that we have more than 70 students just from 2 outbound groups that we haven't recorded and we didn't record. So yes, it's anecdotal, yes, it's only from one institution, but if you replicate that data collation error, let's call it, across all the universities in Australia, the mobility that students are undertaking in a voluntary capacity that relates to their coursework is actually a hidden phenomenon. So I think the next wave of mobility that sits outside exchange is to be uncovering where these students are going and what they're doing, and actually linking that back into curriculum. So that's my final point. And if anyone would like to go and look at an absolute best practice case example, Monash Motorsport, who recently placed 3rd in World Formula 3 Student Car Championships, is made up of 25 student engineers from Monash University for a non-credit experience. They're not included in this number. I can bring 5 of those guys and they can talk incredibly articulately about how that team-based experience in building that car absolutely relates back to their engineering degree. So my challenge is that I actually think the students who are performing non-credit-based mobility, my sense is that they are having a more transformational experience than the students who are exchanging. So it's not to say that exchange is gone and dead, but perhaps there are lessons to learn from the non-credit students about how to build some of that preparation into the exchange students. Thank you very much for your time. I'm happy to take questions when we get to it.
Today I'm going to talk about teaching globalization, and I'm a little bit different from the other presenters in that I like to think of this as the report from the coal face. What I'm going to do in the next 15, 20 minutes or so is just talk about my experience in the classroom trying to do some of the things that my predecessors in this panel have spoken about. And in particular, talk about some of the problems I've had. And again, as Dr. Patel said, the interesting thing about these problems is that there's never one solution. To me, the solution is the awareness of the problems and then finding a case-by-case solution to each one. But what I found in teaching globalization is the main problem is what I call the binary, and I'll explain what I mean by that. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about myself, who I am. I actually don't have a education background. I'm an anthropologist. I've always been an anthropologist, and I think my training as an anthropologist probably has given me a little bit of an edge on the global trends in education. I've always had a priority, both personally and professionally, of something I would call intercultural awareness. In the old days, anthropologists called it cultural relativism. Cultural relativism has gotten a bit of a bad rap in the last 10, 20 years or so, and now we say intercultural awareness. That's always been a part of me as a person, and so when, as you also know, the various BA reviews and reflections on what we teach in higher education in Australia has pushed in the last 10 years or so towards interdisciplinarity, intercultural awareness, and so on. And so that's why some years ago, I think I started this in 2007, so I've been doing it for over 5 years. I put my hand up and said, as a member of the Faculty of Arts and also as a member of the School of Languages, Cultures and Linguistics, I as an academic really care about different modes of expression and different ways of seeing the world, so this is why I wanted to do it. Another reason why I wanted to do it was that in looking at today's student cohort, it seems to me that the 18 to 21-year-olds mostly that I'm teaching at the undergraduate level are interested in travel, and that may be career or it just may be personal. Kids like to move. Mobility is a word that is attractive on many levels. They're interested in global career opportunities. They want to think that they can get jobs somewhere else. Or they want to think that they will get jobs here that take them places. Mobility is a very attractive concept to undergraduates on a variety of levels. And the other thing is the pervasiveness and the opportunities in technology and ICT, which are often connected to global opportunities. And so you get this idea that it's vocational as well as personal, and this idea of being a global citizen is something that you might personally aspire to, but you also want to put on your resume. So what have I done? I have taught globalization for 4 years at a different G8 university here in Australia, and it was what those of you who are from the Faculty of Arts at Monash, you know the term the gateway. You know, we're talking about them in terms of our BA review for 2014. When I taught globalization at first year level, it was considered a gateway subject, which meant it was a very large subject. I think enrollments ranged over those 4 years from anywhere from about 375 students, and the upper range, I think at most we had about 540. When we were running, and that was the final year, we ran it at 540. We had 33 streams of tutorials and a teaching team of approximately 8, where each tutor took, or teaching assistant took up to 5 tutorials, and I had a full-time level A appointment to assist me with the management of 506. So it was a very well-supported program. I left that university and I came to Monash, and I think one of the reasons why I was brought was to integrate globalization into the curriculum. And so in 2012, my first semester here, I taught an already existing subject, which was interesting. The subject existed, there was just no one to teach it. So I stepped right into it. And I taught it at second and third year. And so when I give examples of teaching, I'm actually being a little bit sneaky, and I'm kind of mixing up the two experiences. There were differences in teaching it as a first year gateway as opposed to a second and third year elective. But there were some commonalities as well, and I'll focus on the commonalities. But I will say that the subject, Global Cultures and Local Traditions, is slated to be a third year capstone, which is again in the new BA at Monash. We're going to have what we call gateways that you start with, the center components, which are usually electives, and then the capstone, which will be offered at third year, is compulsory for those doing the major. So what is interesting is that this has been slated to become a capstone for the International Studies major at Monash. As you probably know, that's administered through the School of Historical and Philosophical Studies, even though I'm in LCL. And it's an example of this push, which comes from the top, of this faculty without borders. The Faculty of Arts is really trying to push this inter-school collaboration in its education. And I'll just point out that even though today I'll be talking about the undergraduate experience, globalization is very big at the HDR level. I supervise nearly all of my supervisory experience, whether it's at 4th year, research MA, coursework MA, or PhD, is about globalization. I've done, just at the PhD level, internationalization of higher education in Japan, global flows of musical styles across interconnecting the US, Japan, and South America. And I've also done globalization of food culture in Australia. This is what students want to be doing at all levels. Now, the biggest challenge in teaching globalization, whether it's first, second, or third year level, is this idea of the moving target. Globalization is happening. It's not happened. It's happening. And sometimes students can feel a bit insecure about studying something that isn't a finished product that you can look back on. It's exciting that it's happening now, but it's also it's an unstable target of inquiry. The second thing that I've seen difficult is this idea of getting students to stand outside their positions to see a phenomenon as objectively as possible. And this is more important when you're teaching it at the first year level. Second and third year students have a bit more maturity, and it's often a social maturity, not just an intellectual maturity, but to be able to stand outside yourself and look at a global society from a less subjective point of view. And then this is picking up on what Dr. Patel was speaking about, keeping class discourse respectful, and yet I would say yet truthful to academic and ethical values. Do I allow, for example, in a tutorial discussion section, let a student freely express him or herself if it's actually factually incorrect? Do I put up my hand and say, well, actually you don't want to be saying that because you're wrong? And this happens, I think, in a way more often when I teach globalization, when I teach other kinds of subjects like history subjects. It's very easy to say, oh, I'm sorry, that treaty was not concluded in 1868, it was actually 1890, so we need to, that's really easy to correct. It's not as easy in these situations. So what I try to do to get on top of these challenges is to create a syllabus that tells a story. And the story, as much as possible, is linear, even though I argue that globalization is not linear, but to tell a linear story that grounds this moving target to the students. And you can see here are 4 slides that I show on the first day. And I show these slides pretty much on the first day for whatever level I'm teaching it at. And so the first one you can see is I give a definition of it by Zygmunt Bauman, who so you know, very, very famous European philosopher. And I give some flash words. Global financial crisis, everybody knows what that is. The global pandemic, you know, we had, whether it's avian flu, SARS, or H1N1, everybody knows, global, the global village. So I give them these sort of anchors. And then, again, definitions. And the main thing that I try to get at in the first one is this idea of space and time compression and globalization dividing as much as it unites. And so what you take home from this is, and again, this is standing outside, a connection between disparate phenomena, like what happens around you versus what happens somewhere else, improved general knowledge of international issues and current affairs, and a sense of personal responsibility and engagement. Another way of telling the story is looking at debates, migration, trade, technology. You said that students are about family, religion, and history. My students are all about money and Facebook, basically. These are the things that gets them going. They're not so interested in religion. They're interested about fair trade coffee. Buy it, yes or no. You get that's where they get the personal responsibility. I'll point out that I do at first year talk quite a bit about international institutions such as the UN, the WHO, but I don't teach this at second and third year because they've usually had it already. Clash of civilizations, end of history, cultural extinction, homogenized global media. These are the topics that really gain traction with our students. The binaries. You see them sitting on opposite sides of the room. You get the free trade capitalists versus the Naomi Klein followers, if you're, you know her very famous book, No Logo. The modernists versus the postmodernists, where history is always forward, must never look back, versus no, actually we screwed it up now. We need to go back. Get a lot of this. Nationalism, we still get a little bit of this. We have the Aussie, oi, 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 versus those who say, no, we want to imagine there are no countries. Nothing to kill or die for. That's even though I understand where you're coming from, I think a lot of our students in Australia, both domestic and international, ascribe to a more humanist point of view where, no, I don't want to be a part of a country that kills or dies for religion or whatever. Another one is Facebook, love it or hate it. Another variant is the BitTorrents, the piracy issue. Students love to talk about media piracy, and that's again a kind of a global phenomenon. I love it versus, I'm not going to say that I love it, but I do, because it's actually technically a crime. There's no such thing as an innocent tourist. Yes, there is. I'm one. Are you? I don't know. Intercultural understanding is never truly authentic. What's wrong with eating sushi with a fork? It's not authentic. So what? It is. No. Yes. So, the comfort zone. What I did in putting this together, I emailed some of those 8 colleagues that I worked with. I said, from your point of view, what was your experience pushing the comfort zone? And this is a quote from a junior colleague of mine. Students are so immersed in globalization that they take it for granted. So the challenge is to show them how and why things weren't always like this. The process is not uneven, not teleological. That's that modernist point of view. So the biggest payoff came from teaching the bits about what it was like before, and so you show them how things have changed, so you're actually teaching in reverse. And this, I think, helps get around that kind of moving target problem. If you focus on the past, you're actually showing them the way to the present. Sometimes students are more comfortable in the sci-fi future, and they're not comfortable about looking at now. And that personal responsibility is often a very uncomfortable place to be. One thing that I remember came up, we were talking about free trade coffee and cageless hens. And one of my tutors put up and said, it seems, and it said, how many of you have sponsored a child in sub-Saharan Africa through a charity organization? Out of the 300 students, one person raised their hand. Yet how many of you buy fair trade coffee? How many of you buy cageless chicken eggs? And so he put forward, why do you care more about chickens than you do about children? And they were like, oh my God, we do. And then what comes out is the idea that we believe that humans have agency and people in sub-Saharan Africa need to get their act together on their own. So it's the chickens we have to be careful of. The whales can't save themselves, but people can. And that is a very uncomfortable moment. And here we are, the student's own role in the processes of global change. It can be used as a call to action. Give the chickens a rest and let's look at people. But that's very difficult. And sometimes it's quite self-indulgent. How do I feel about chickens? How do I feel about children? And it can become quite narcissistic. And so what we're always trying to do is to push it out. It's not about you, because the vast majority, not everybody, but the vast majority of the people in the classroom live privileged lives in a global context. And it's getting the people to think outside that privilege, which is the most difficult. This is my last slide. Just I'm sure these will be available. You can see, this is how I taught it at Monash, in the International Studies program. The story was a little bit different because it was at third year level. We did concepts first, then we moved to what is a global culture, and then what are the tensions with local culture. The best people were very interested in ideas of travel, otherness and tourism, appropriation was very popular, and of course, piracy and protection was, I think, the #1 most popular theme. Everybody wanted to talk about downloading music. And has it really destroyed, or has it supported the global artistic developments across the nation? All right, that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My topic is academic mobility and intercultural engagement. And a little bit about myself, why this topic. I have been a participant and researcher of academic mobility, and most recently I was a part of the Erasmus Mundus postdoctoral research exchange, and I was actually selected for the first year when Australia became engaged in this scheme of Erasmus Mundus, and it allowed me to spend almost a year in Rome, Italy, at the University Lewis, which is the free International University of Social Sciences. And I will be talking about my own experience and also about my ongoing research on academic mobility. And I understand academic mobility as international mobility of students and academic staff for professional career purposes. And this topic of academic mobility became especially popular after several academic mobility programs were adopted by the European Union. And it was quite an innovative way of looking at academic mobility as contributing to education and training, which is essential for the development of today's knowledge, society, and economy. And in the early 1990s, the European Council has adopted several lifelong learning programs, which are all programs that relate to academic mobility for different levels of school. And there's a comenius program for schools, Erasmus for higher education, Leonardo da Vinci for vocational education and training, and Grundtvig for adult education. And I view academic mobility as a part of the overall changing pattern of mobilities and diverse mobilities. And instead of looking at mobilities and migration in a traditional way of migrating for settlement, we now see that patterns of mobilities and migration are diversifying, and we are talking about hypermobility, circular migration, return migration, shuttle migration, and there are also other different new terms that are invented for globally mobile citizens, such as astronaut kids, and so on. And these new developments in migration and mobility, I view them as a huge potential for knowledge exchange, knowledge mobilization, knowledge transfer, and ultimately knowledge creation. And also I see these diverse mobilities as sites for interactions of different ethnic identities, cultural patterns, and academic traditions. And in researching academic mobility, I perceive that the role of culture is increasing in social interactions and cultural integration. So, going back to my doctoral research, I was interested in the role of culture and cultural patterns in human interactions. A little bit more about the Erasmus program. So, although Erasmus is linked to the name of the medieval philosopher Erasmus, the Erasmus actually stands for European Community Action Scheme for the Mobility of University Students, and it started officially in 1987, and last year it celebrated its 25th anniversary. Each year, more than 230,000 students study abroad under this program, and a total of 3 million students actually benefited from this program in the last 25 years. And the students are coming from over 4,000 higher education institutions in 33 countries. So this very popular and well-attended program had its extension in the form of Erasmus Mundus, which offers scholarships and academic cooperation between Europe and the rest of the world. And there's also an international addition to this program, which is called Campus, and it offers help in modernizing higher education in EU neighbors. And it was established a bit later in 1990 and now covers 27 countries. And so there's a talk in the news about funding being cut to the Erasmus program, and had this response from the streets. People are manifesting, demonstrating in support of the Erasmus program. Let's say Erasmus. And since my exchange was done in Italy, I have looked at the numbers of Italian students who have studied abroad, and the numbers are quite impressive. 21,000 in the last year reported, and Italy is the 4th country in terms of the numbers of exchange students, after Spain, France, and Germany. And Erasmus has reached Australia. The students Australia in 2004, and since then 90 Australian students were awarded scholarships. And among scholars, there's quite a modest participation rate. A total of 86 people participated. And the gender imbalance is also a bit striking, as you see. But it's, yeah, females are gaining their ground. And in the last year reported 13 females and 20 males participated in this Erasmus Mundus exchange from Australia. And when I became interested in the topic of academic mobility, I was delighted to discover that the first conference, inaugural conference on academic mobility was held in Finland, and I was delighted to participate in that in 2006. And it was the first conference that analyzed the results of the Erasmus program, and it set up some themes and some topics for further investigation. And some topics that were discussed there were differences in academic expectations among non-local students and staff, differences in modes of academic writing and critical reading, differences in understanding of academic interpersonal relations, educational prerequisites for success in academic intercultural dialogue were also approached differently. And also, this conference discussed best practices of intercultural dialogue in academia internationally. And the main conclusion from this conference that I drew was this quote from the scholar Alberto. And this conclusion is that mobility without education is nothing but rule of soul. And the second conference on academic mobility was held in Estonia in 2009, and the third conference that was actually more important was held last year in July in Poland, and this conference has also brought some new approaches to academic mobility. First of all, it combined academic mobility with migration, and it is officially called Conference on Academic Mobility and Migration. And it was the acknowledgement that mobility and migration go hand in hand, and often migration results in mobility, and vice versa, mobility results in migration. And also this conference reached the Asia-Pacific region in recognition of its active participation in the global academic mobility. And the group of academic migrants provided us such an interesting topic for research. Compared to other migration categories, they possess all these interesting characteristics that I thought would be interesting to explore further. And the main characteristics that are of interest to me are that often displayed global outlooks and cosmopolitan dispositions. So when I mentioned my interest in the role of culture in intercultural exchange and academic mobility, it brought me to this concept of habitus, which is a concept popularized by Bourdieu, and it's stemming from his work on cultural capital. And it is a way of operationalization in culture. So it's a way of looking at the culture in operational way. So what is culture? And culture can be described as habitus, which is long-lasting dispositions of the mind and the body. It can be seen as a totality of learned habits, bodily skills, style, tastes, and other non-discursive knowledges that go without saying. And it's also a way of being, a habitual state, and a predisposition, tendency, propensity, or inclination. And the most important aspects of culture are those non-discursive aspects and unconscious aspects. And when I looked at culture, I was drawn by this dualism of collectivism and individualism, two big cultural patterns that are often described in literature and are often juxtaposed in literature. And collectivism describes interdependent members of the collective who align personal goals with communal goals, while individualism is about individual autonomy and independence of the self, where individuals rely on their own beliefs and expectations and experiences. And these cultural patterns or cultural models differ in many aspects of behaviors, attitudes, values, and beliefs. And they can be aligned along these concepts of relation to authority, conception of the self, and ways of dealing with conflicts. And when I was conducting interviews with my participants, as academic migrants, I have asked questions about all these differences, and I have collected many stories that describe all these different ways of understanding the society and the self. But also I asked questions about their ways of overcoming these differences and their ways of being successful in intercultural interactions. And this brought me to the idea of cosmopolitanism. What my participants were describing all these issues that are presented under the theme of cosmopolitanism. And I was looking for transformational aspects of my participants. What are the transformations that we can find? What are the evidence of transformational changes that can occur on the ground? And I became interested in cosmopolitanism, and cosmopolitanism is again an old concept that goes back to the philosophy of the Stoics and to Kant, and more recently to Ulrich Beck, who has discussed three main components of cosmopolitanism: globality, which is an openness to the world, awareness of the global sphere of responsibility and globally shared collective futures; plurality, acknowledgement of the otherness of others, and commitment to stimulate the self-reflexivity of divergent, independent, cosmopolitan identities; and civility, commitment to soft power dialogues and non-violence. And Australian scholars have been keen on adopting this concept of cosmopolitanism in their writing, and Ulrich Beck is usually taken as a father of modern understanding of cosmopolitanism, and Hans' definition of cosmopolitanism as an orientation and willingness to engage with the other, intellectual and aesthetic openness toward divergent cultural experiences, a search for contrast rather than uniformity. And our Australian researchers, Calcutt and others, have also identified Kantian universalism, cross-cultural competence, and either willingness to tolerate or engage with others. And while the idea of toleration is a bit questionable, collaboration against minor conflict and opposition. I'm more supportive of the idea of engagement with otherness and cultural openness. And cultural openness is an important part of cosmopolitan dispositions. And it means the search for and delight in the contrast between societies rather than a longing for superiority or for uniformity. And in my interviews with academic migrants, I have actually identified some evidence of this growing cosmopolitan dispositions and cosmopolitan values, and they can be all described under this terms of cultural awareness, cognitive style of communication, intercultural competence, cultural intelligence, intercultural openness, acceptance, willingness to engage, limited power distance, and interpersonal engagement. And my future research actually takes me in this direction, and it will be looking at academic migrants as important agents of all these processes of knowledge exchange and knowledge creation. And I will be looking forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
I'd like to start with a question, if I may. And Liudmila, with your research, I was very interested. Have you published the results from your thesis yet?
Yes, I published. I actually published my thesis as a book. It's like a modified version of my thesis published as a book.
Yes.
In 2011. And it looked at academic mobility and intercultural dialogue in 3 countries. Australia, Canada, and Italy.
Well, if you find
I
enough
should
to
mention
send-
that before.
No, I'll send it around, and I'll send it around to people. Thank you very much. Okay, I'll open to the floor for questions, please. Thank you.
Thank you. My question is inspired by Trevor Goddard's presentation of all the different forms of mobility. Is this working?
I can hear, but I'm not sure whether people are doing.
Yeah, it's inspired by looking at all the different forms of mobility, both in and out of university. It's very interesting, but other speakers may have views as well. But as soon as you start seeing students coming in and out in so many different ways, it opens up huge questions of access and equality, doesn't it? And I am the first to confess I've never seemed to know how this is funded, but especially that category of non-credit mobility we talked about. Obviously that is self-funded by students. So I'm glad that Bauman came up, because of course he talks about mobility entitlements and stratification of societies now, or global society, on the basis of mobility entitlements. So I just wonder, are we looking carefully at the profiles of who's moving in and out, how students are moving, and are we supporting the idea of, as far as possible, equality of access to mobility for students?
Yeah, it's can you hear me? It's a great question, always around equity, and I don't think someone made a comment earlier about the solution actually being, at least it's being discussed, and that you don't actually get to any point. And I think it's not a way of avoiding the question, but equity always raises that notion. You never completely address it, because when you think you've addressed one thing, you have a new context, and then there's a new equity issue. I'll give you a couple of concrete points that might answer the question to a degree. Yes, lots of voluntary mobility tends to be student funded, but that's because the sector hasn't in fact caught up with that being the growth area. Just as an example, in the Asia-bound funding, which is around 37 million that the government is just rolling out for mobility to Asia across the next 5 years, for the very first time, they're actually starting to look at and potentially make a decision around it, not always needing to be for credit mobility. Now, from the government's perspective, that would be a monumental change in shift in how they've previously funded very conservative-based mobility. So that's one aspect. The second is at institutional level, certainly at Monash, where we're seeing this as not only an important area, but the future of a growth area.
So we've made, albeit very small steps, to start providing some funding for students to support some of that voluntary-based or non-credit mobility. And what I should perhaps just clarify is that non-credit needn't always be voluntary in that the student takes completely outside the context of the university. When Professor Shoemaker speaks later on this morning or earlier this afternoon, certainly one of the projects he's overseen is the Oxfam partnership at Monash. So for those students, it's a high-profile internship opportunity that doesn't always relate back into a credit-bearing aspect of their course, but in terms of adding an international dimension to their course is a fantastic example. The Monash Motorsport example I gave earlier, they're very heavily supported and funded by lots of engineering firms around Melbourne, tyres, etc. I'm not an engineer, so I'm not even going to lay claim to what else they get sponsored for. But those guys actually go away for a month-funded trip through Europe for their racing season, and for many of them, they'll probably have to come up with between $800 to $1,000 out of their own pocket. So for a month in Europe racing a car, that starts to me to show that equity is actually being addressed. The traditional exchange model probably perpetuates the notion of exchange being for a higher socially mobile or calibre student because of the expense that relates to it. However, we've done a little bit of work looking at the demographic of our students that travel, and it's interesting that it's often students who you might deem to be of a lesser socio-demographic profile that are seeing this as being a way of adding another dimension, choosing to invest their money with a student that has the part-time job that's not hot party, but says, I've saved $10,000 and I want to invest it in a semester in France. And so the equity issue has so much that you can unpack underneath it.
If there are questions, we might actually get the speakers to go to the podium. Another question, please, from the floor. Sorry to cut people short, but we're just trying to. Thank you.
This question is for Professor Stevens. I'm Anita here from the library. I'm just wondering, with the profile of the students in your class or in everyone's class at Monash, which is very diverse, where they're themselves being, when they themselves are being globalized, yes. When you teach these subjects, these units, okay, do you get different attitudes, or should I say different reactions from the students?
Yes, that's actually a really good point, and I'll say that it's different at first year than it is at second and third year. My experience is that international students at first year are usually, especially if it's their first semester, we spend a lot of time trying to draw them out. Language difficulties being, and sort of culture shock being the main thing. If you look at the syllabus, even at the third year I'm doing it, but the main reason why we did it the first year, we have a subject blog, which allows students to express their views in a non-verbal way, but in a written way, and that encourages the international students to express any kind of different opinion. I'll say though, at third year, the international students are in it just like everyone else, and I think you'd be surprised that there is not as much of a gap. What we do see, what I have seen, is a difference in the way Australian-born Asian students go at Australian-born Anglo students, which is really quite interesting. And I think part of the reason why they will have a go at each other is that they feel they're on more equal grounding. But at the same time, I've had students from Korea at Monash at third year get up and say, well, this is what I think of Gangnam Style, and I can tell you it's blah. And I think the differences are not as great as you might think they are, but they're magnified at first year.
Well, Caroline said, we have another question for Caroline, please. Yes? Rosemary.
I'm always been interested in sort of teasing out the relationship and the differences between internationalisation and the international perspective and cosmopolitanism, because times it seems as if cosmopolitanism is used as a sort of an equivalent, but at other times, I don't know what people would think about this, but it's used as a sort of a lightweight correlate to the other.
I teach cosmopolitanism in a lecture, and the first thing is they have to realize it's not a drink from Sex and the City. That tends to be the image, and what it is, again, it's often when we teach cosmopolitanism, we put on the music video for Imagine John Lennon, because in my opinion, that's the true cosmopolitanism. It's the breaking down of barriers to share certain values. I think students aspire to that, and in open discussions, they will align themselves with that view, yet in their writings and in their in smaller interactions, there are still many barriers. National identity and national values, which may have to do with things like save the whales, still very strong. Save the whales for everyone but the Eskimos in Finland. Okay, well let's still breaking down. Cosmopolitanism is a very difficult topic, and it's all about peeling back and starting from the beginning. And pop culture is a great way to do this. I always show music videos, and that really helps.
I'm wondering if the other panel members might like to respond to. If so, you need to go to the podium. That's Liudmila. Feel free to join in any time.
Talking about cosmopolitanism can be perceived as a new buzzword, and we all know all these different other concepts that we have all talked about, and they are multiculturalism and cultural diversity. We have studied in depth racism and discrimination and inequalities. And recently we have also talked about social cohesion and social inclusion, and it seems that cosmopolitanism is big umbrella term for discussing maybe a different type of intercultural relationships, but maybe it's just a different approach and a different perspective of looking at intercultural relations and intercultural relations. And for me, cosmopolitanism has this appeal of uniting ideas and talking about intercultural interactions beyond racism and beyond discrimination, and even post-multiculturalism and post-social cohesion, since all these terms have been somehow discredited in recent literature. Students are puzzled when they hear about cosmopolitanism. They are probably more comfortable in discussing multiculturalism or racism, more traditional topics and more traditional concepts. But cosmopolitanism has a lot to offer. It can be approached in different levels, and one level is just overlooking nation borders, and the other way is looking at these cosmopolitan values and cosmopolitan traditions and what are the unifying concepts, instead of talking about our divisions and talking about differences. I think we are moving towards the values and the beliefs that unite us and bring us together.
Oh, we have Liudmila here. Is there another question specifically for Liudmila? Thank you.
Well, I have a more general question, but certainly you could answer that.
Thank you.
You were talking about things like recontextualisation and value systems, Dr. Li, and also this idea of being transformational. I teach a subject which is about global Indigenous issues, and I have trouble with words like Eskimo, right? I have problems with words like the hierarchy of a totem pole, and using an Indigenous artwork freely on somebody's PowerPoint, probably without permission. So this idea of recontextualisation and value systems, I want to know what you guys think about your curriculum in the sense of a dynamic form of pedagogy that includes social change, and in fact people looking inside themselves to look for better ways of using language and better ways of incorporating the new value systems that are part of globalisation, but you haven't really included those. I'm just asking.
Well, when I gave that example, it was a rhetorical example. There are no Eskimos in Finland, obviously. I agree, and one of the things that
no, just the word Eskimo, man, you know, like...
Well, I was quoting a student response to demonstrate, and maybe this is where the disclaimer comes in, that there is quite a lot of mixed messages out there, and students don't know. They think cosmopolitanism is a drink, and so that's the group that we're working in. Maybe I'll let you have that.
Yeah, thank you for that. That I think is really the critical question when it comes to global engagement, and that is why I'm always advocating either a disclaimer and stating up front we're doing this for educational purposes, but at the same time our discussions have to educate and inform those who may actually be insensitive and not be thinking about the value and belief systems. And a lot of what I was saying, although I was sort of rushing through it, is you really have to be self-critical about who you are, where you come from, and what you hold dear in terms of beliefs and value systems before you attempt to find out what's the richness in other cultures that we can connect in. I think what we've been doing for too long, over decades, is we've been looking at the differences, and we haven't been interrogating belief systems and value systems and having these frank discussions. So going back to your question, I think it's important to tell you the truth. I was struck by the example of the totem pole. I was struck by the Eskimo because there wasn't a prefacing of what we're doing, and there wasn't an explanation of its contextualization. And I think Ming's perspective that he put forward about reconceptualizing, reframing, recontextualizing, it's a lot of work. As Trevor said, just bringing the mobility questions and issues to curriculum, it's a lot of work. Do we have the energy? That's the challenge for us. It's okay talking about sexy terms, whether they're globalization or cosmopolitanism or whatever you want. But when we get together, can we talk about these things? And can we go away more informed and more educated and more respectful in our communication? And one of the other things I wanted to say is, in terms again of your last question, is it goes beyond being sensitive to words and that. It's having that mutual respect and understanding to the point that you don't have to be reminded to be sensitive. You just are. It's about that local, global blink of the eye. Is you have to, one of the things I didn't mention but it was in my PowerPoint, is we have to learn to have a global or a local presence of mind, a global engagement, a presence of mind. I have to know what is not acceptable or what is tolerable, but what is the right way to approach something. And I can't teach anybody that, and you can't teach anybody. You have to come to it yourself.
Trevor, thank you.
Just a quick comment from a mobility perspective. One of the things that I would say is really important that we instill for students is that one thing that mobility does is puts you in a place where you have to actually make mistakes, and you are going to make mistakes. And I think there's a duality in one of the slides that came up earlier around the rights and responsibility, that if you're in an environment, you should make a mistake, because that's actually part of learning. And I think for me, what's happened sometimes around language is that I respect people's need to be sensitive to the use of language, and I respect the fact that it has a meaning for them. What needs to be shared back is when people do make mistakes, because that's where the learning occurs. And I think sometimes what happens in higher education, if we go back to the film analogies that were being used, you see students at times quite transfixed or caught because they're so fearful of making a mistake. And I would say, not just personally, but from a lot of our students that travel overseas, the propensity to make mistakes increases, and that's one of the reasons why lots of students should go, because you learn a lot about yourself and where your own views come from by making those mistakes.
Yes, and I think we're ready for Mingsheng to respond as well.
Oh, sorry, Mingsheng, do you want to go first? Do you have a response? Do you want to go first? Would you like to respond to the issue?
Hello, Mingsheng, can you hear us?
Are you talking to me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, could I just ask you,
because the transmission problem.
Yes.
Yes, I've heard about transformational approach to the teaching pedagogy. Yes, Fay was right. That is, we need to have kind of tolerance, understanding, awareness. Transformation means we have to change people's views, their outlooks, and also their previous understandings. Sometimes this kind of change can be very difficult because our beliefs are there, and especially our fundamental beliefs that can be difficult for us to change. But it's very important for us to try this kind of method to change people's mindsets and to provide new perspectives and new ideas and new outlooks, so people can make choice instead of imposing this on these people. But once we have provided something, some new ideas, new concepts, and so on, this can give students or academics a kind of opportunity to select what they like, and sometimes education takes place, that is, transformation takes place without our knowledge.
I just also want to add that at the coalface, I can say that students don't want to be told what to think, and that's no matter how much you want to be transformational, sometimes that can really put up a wall. And so what I try to do, and I always say, because you don't want to come off as the preachy one either. You're there to lead students to knowledge rather than push them off the cliff. So what I do is I say, I'm not going to tell you what to believe, but I'm going to at least look at different beliefs and peel away the assumptions behind them so that you can look at your values and understand how you got there. And then the decision's up to you.
Yeah, and just as a last concluding point, I just want to say that it is, global engagement might actually be disguising the fundamental intricacies of the sensitive issues that we have to come to talk about. And generally, we have not come to the table to talk about this, and so that is why, going back to Trevor's point, we all work in silos. You know, it's okay for me to work in the mobility corner, and then you in the curriculum corner, and that. Because if we come together, we're going to explode simply because of exactly what we brought up today. And I think we have to be more than aware of it. We have to do something about it. Two quick things. The reason I had given a first-year class on intercultural communication an assignment on your first discovery assignment in the first 2 weeks of this term is go away and find a derogatory label that you use every day, or you hear your friends, your family, and your neighbors use, and find out what it means. And that assignment came back in the first 5 minutes of that class, and I asked, so what did you find out? There was silence for 5 minutes. Nobody wanted to speak, because what they found out shocked them, educated them, and just completely blew their minds. They found that the swear words they have been using in music, in just everywhere, suddenly were shared not just by the African American people of America, but by the Africans in Africa and by the Middle Eastern Arab speaking nations of the Middle East. They found that the words that were derogatory in China were derogatory in India and were derogatory in Africa. And so it was a whole new learning for them. And so going back to Carolyn's point, it's not about telling them what to think, it's about getting them to find out and to learn for themselves what needs to be the right way. And the last thing is that in another class, there was some assignment given and two students were arguing about whose land it was. And I had to stop the class and ask them what the situation was. And they both happened to come. One was from Iraq, one was from Iran. Up to that point, I didn't know they were from Iraq or Iran. And they were arguing about some city that historically belonged to each one of them. And I had to stop the class because the class divided with this group and that group. And I'm like, okay, are you all from Iran and Iraq? And they're like, no, we're not. This was in a Canadian context. Well, how do you actually take sides? So in order to stop a disruption of the lesson, I said, we're going to stop this now, and you're going to go and research this point and this issue and come with the answer next week. And if you haven't researched it and you haven't got authentic information, don't speak. And when they came the next week, the two students smiled, and I said, well, that's a good sign. What did you discover? Well, at one time in history, some centuries ago, this city belonged to Iran. And now, because of the geographical map shifting, it belongs to Iran. So that was the end of that. How many people researched it? About 5 others. They agreed, and that was the end of that. But that's all part of the global engagement education. It's not going to be painless. It's going to be painful, hurtful, and we're going to have to face it. Thank you.
So first colleagues, I apologize for the podium, just for the elevation, because it is the case that I'd love to be actually talking to you just across the table, but just imagine we're all at one big table. That's the way I'd like to do this. Second thing is I'm going to be talking a lot about entitlements and rights and the way we see the future. And in all of those cases, I also want to, as I'm sure you've done earlier in the day, pay tribute to entitlements and rights to land and space, and indigenous rights to entitlement and land and space. And I think that's something which is not perfunctory, but really deeply held at Monash and many other institutions. So whether it's expressed through elders or others of the community, I do want to pay the tribute. I know that it's done so formally in your conference papers as well. So colleagues, this is a great time to be talking about this topic, and I want to make 3 confessions at the outset. First of all, this is a work in progress. It's always dangerous to say that, but I really want to hear what you think, because I'm going to take this somewhere else and it will go further, I would hope, because of the nature of the contingent nature of some of the conclusions. Second thing is that we are not just at Monash, but in this country, in Australia, and I think arguably in the Asia Pacific, at a fascinating juncture point where all sorts of forces and confluences are coming together. And I'm sure you've heard about some of them this morning. Last year, I addressed an international education conference, which struck me as being almost sectoral, as if South America thought one thing and Europe thought another, and I think that's a real pity. I actually think that global education of a different sort, that's why I've called this Orderless or Borderless world, is what it's about. And I know that some of my colleagues who worked in Monash, South Africa and elsewhere would see, as I said before, the confluences rather than the unusual distinctions. There are distinctive on-ground aspects, but there are things we can really learn from each other. So, first of all, if you can believe it, yesterday I was talking at a conference on medieval and early modern history. Okay? And one of the things which you all imagined was the late-breaking news of Pope Benedict's resignation. And imagine how one takes the past and present come together in one moment. You know, papacy, which itself has existed for centuries. I think the last time that any pope chose to leave was in something like 1315, and then there was another forced to later. But this sort of raised all sorts of issues of the confluence of history and tradition and individual choice, and also this question of if you were teaching about religious history and something just happened like that, how much would you incorporate into a lecture you were giving the next day based on a recent event of that sort? I think a lot, probably. You use it as a kind of jumping off point. And it seems to me that a lot of the time, just the very fact that we are required to 18 months or 12 months or even 6 months in advance file our plans for our course, a bit like a flight plan for an airplane, you know, it's all there in advance, means that those kind of flexibilities are less easily able to be handled at one level. And I would argue that's something we really want to retain, is that kind of flexibility to bring in material almost as it happens, it's relevant, you know. And when I'm saying flight plans, there are regulators, tertiary education quality and standards agency doing a fine job, but I wouldn't want anyone to think that meant that we were hamstrung on the side of creativity or relevance. Okay? So I'm going to talk about a few of these issues today, and some of these slides you will have seen, some you will not have, I'm pretty sure. So the current landscape. Now, some of you would have seen this private sector report into higher education last year, which the consultant company Ernst & Young produced. We know the people who wrote it, we know the people who were interviewed for it, people like you and me, but also mainly in Australia. Okay, so this is not just the world, but has an Australian inflection. Is it too small to read? Can you see it? It's okay. Yeah. So too small maybe for some of you. Okay, so if I go to keywords, I'll tell you what they are. But first of all, how many people have read this report? Anyone in the room? 1, 2, 3, 4, about 5. Okay. So I won't repeat the whole thing, but essentially, I'm not going to say I agree with all of this, but I wanted to just use it as a bit of a trigger for some of your discussion. So, if you talk about global mobility, which is highly relevant to the topic to hand today, it stated this, that emerging markets becoming global scale competitors in the international student market. You see how the language is one of competition and invocation of that rather than cooperation. Academic talent increasingly sourced from emerging markets. Again, it's sort of almost as if one is taken away. And emergence of elite, truly global university brands. Now, as true as that might be on one level, I think that really misses a lot of the point about global mobility in the first place. And this is about institutional reputation building and what being in the top 100 means. And as valid as that is, it's not changing lives on a day-to-day basis. And I think that's what I would argue is what we're about in the first place in the profession. So I have some problems just with the way that global mobility is described in this report as well. Interestingly, too, on digital technologies, which is something that I know you're interested in, these are asserted. Bringing the university to the device, MOOCs and the rise of online learning. Bringing the device to the university, the use of digital technologies in campus-based learning, and blended learning, as if these are all three separate things, and yet have a lot to do with each other. Now, although it's cleverly written, again, I'm going to argue there's a lot more to this one as well, and that's one of the emphases I have today, is how the globally mobile and digital come together in the best way in an ethical framework. Because I do not see much of a sort of doff of the cap or even any sincere approach to the ethics of higher education and what that means. What is the ethical university in this environment, and why is that important? It's one of the questions that I'd like to ask and relate to this topic. So when I'm saying orderless world or borderless world, I'm meaning in that context. Okay? Where are we headed? You can take a lot more out of this as well in terms of democratization, which is another theme. And we know that the content is ubiquitous, but is it really? Because not just talking about filtering, but there's one thing to argue for access to information. There's another to argue about how one deploys it and learns from it and how information and wisdom connect. And the two are not the same. So on that note, I wanted to just refer to something I actually did write myself earlier, and I'm just going to quote from this a couple years ago. So I argue, and this is linked to this topic, that in advanced Western nations, first of all, with highly developed university systems, are thinking about the concept and actuality of academic freedom, and the role of the university has in no way kept pace with the urgent and pressing changes in both media and internet freedoms around the world. I will also argue that now is the time for that imbalance to be rectified. Put another way, it's insufficient to assert that simple access to online technology or digital education in its own right, to knowledge in digital repositories, is the primary issue. Were this so, then the rather triumphalist and often inaccurate rhetoric, which frequently attaches to the spread of online learning globally, would be sufficient. It's not, in my view. For if increased freedom is equated with increased internet penetration, without any true consideration of regulation, as I've mentioned before, and control, or the socio-cultural dimensions of use, then it will completely occlude many of these key issues. So I'd like to demonstrate today that context of things like political action, social enterprise, human rights is equally important in the educational environment. And that I actually think our roles get put into question. What is the role of the academic or the researcher or the teacher, most importantly? For as I hope to demonstrate, that context of slightly radical thought and behavior is crucial, and the space of what I call academic activism in an ethical environment is one we should actually inhabit in our curriculum, in our research, and in our institutional commitments. And so I'm just putting it on the table, that's what I believe. And you're at liberty to disagree, and many people do, but I just think it's something to try to aim towards in higher education. Therefore, I think this misses a lot of that. Okay? It's very mechanistic in my view, and the report misses a lot. So a few ironies for you, colleagues, and I'd love to hear what you think about these. First, talking about situation in place, and in time, and in space, and yet also the desire, and we see this as a fact around the world, to build not classrooms, but residential accommodation on universities. There's more money spent, way more money spent, on residential accommodation at the moment than new university classrooms. It's interesting to see. And it's a response to all sorts of social forces and migration forces, safety issues, and so on. We see it at Monash. We have 600 new residential beds at the Clayton campus, which opened in the last year and a half. They're brilliant. Well, why are they there? This is part of what's going on in the world. So we have different streams of knowledge, so online and physical emplacement at the same moment. What's going on there? Second, a fascinating new version of the world through massive open online courseware, and indeed, I think it's got a lot to offer, a lot to challenge. Now, the term superstar might be a bit of an exaggeration, but it's people who are getting much better known by the world than they ever were before, and probably some deservedly so. And the first thing that happens is the people who are talking, and it's through a venue like TED Talks. I'm invited to speak at 300 venues face-to-face, immediately as a direct result. So you sort of see this happening. They're on the tour, okay? So, and no one feels the same satisfaction ever again because they've seen this talk, they want to hear them. And so we still see this kind of factor in some of the major, what you might call blockbuster tours as well, whether they be musical or others. And I think that's absolutely, human nature makes a lot of sense to say that one can have a channel which is driven through YouTube or a channel that's driven through some other source, another one which is to some extent face-to-face. And this is a challenge for us in higher education. What do they equate to for us? What is that face-to-face in the future, and how will it work? How will it work when you're moving across borders in international countries? Is it enough to have this webcam, or is that just a very small gesture in the right direction? Okay, that's one of the questions I'd like to ask. Another, the first thing that happens when MOOCs are offered, and how many of you have done one, by the way? How many people have been enrolled in a massive open online course? Many of you? Couple? 3, 4? Okay, so we did a bit of a survey to find out, and I'll show you some of the evidence as well. And a lot of the people enrolled the first time around are other academics, having a look as well, which makes a lot of sense, because we want to see, is there an advance in pedagogy here, is there an advance in the limits of learning and how they're addressed? And the other fascinating thing is, without it even being guided necessarily, people just want to meet up again in person. And they do so in cities all over the planet. Look at this Coursera example. And all of those red marks and the arrow are places where people, their meetup groups that are self-organized in a fascinating way to take it further. And people have said, quite honestly, to take this further, let's meet up to discuss Coursera. Meet up a sustainability course. writing for scientific articles. All of them are self-organized. This is a fantastic thing being unleashed, which is sort of human nature desiring communication of many different sorts at the same time. And I think that's fabulous and also border breaking and entirely logical when you think about it. But it's not national necessarily. It's not political. It's very much personal. And so at the same time you have this incredible scale, as never before, of information being narrowcast, broadcast, disseminated, and very individual responses to it. And the question for us is, how does one design any sort of offering in higher education which is going to be capturing both excellence, the superlative nature of content and challenge, and scale at the same time? I mean, that has never really been the challenge before, quite in that way. And yet here's another example of it. By the same token, that's also occurring. So many of you would have seen the figures on student debt and student poverty around the world. And I'm talking about not just in countries which themselves are developing, but in advanced nations, the level of student debt has never been higher. The level of student debt in the United States 2 years ago, on average per capita per student, was higher than the level per capita of credit card debt in the United States. I'm sure you knew that. But to me, that's when I argue about context, it's really important. So when you're adding all of these elements to access, but each of the elements of access has a cost, whether it's broadband access or device and so on, nothing is as simple as it looks. So what is the limit to learning just on that practical level? And yet, of course, the universities which are themselves in one way offering to the world something gratis are also offering many times to their students a very highly expensive experience. Now, you might offset that through things like scholarships and so on, but both of these things are happening at once. Just a fascinating to imagine the forces at play. And for me, they're not inconsistent necessarily, but they need to be unpicked and examined further. Why is that so? And of course, you've seen these sorts of diagrams before. Some argue that time has now become relegated to a second-class citizenship position, and that all the time being available is terrific. This concept of 24/7 learning. What does that actually mean? What does that actually mean? If you take that back and look at what we said before about the meetup groups, and that seems to be talking about a specific time and place, narrowing it down, pinning it down, designing it. It isn't just open and this many hours a day. It's actually a very precise sliver or slice which is being invoked. So it isn't just the case that we can learn anytime. I just think that's a fallacy, and people, psychologists will tell you, and brain specialists will tell you that in terms of neuroscience, it's not as if you can learn equally well at all times of the day either. So what we are seeing is different indications of that as well. So I'm going to talk a bit more about MOOCs because I think that there's a lot of debate here, and it's hot at the moment for many reasons, not the least of which is Australia's right in the middle of it as well. So we've seen the business model for many of them, and here's the summary for you. And this is changing daily. I mean, we literally, if you follow the channels of communication on these things, you'll find that accreditation is being issued one day, or there's another group being formed, or another signing to a different channel. And of course, companies like Pearson are front and center here because they're the only ones who have figured out how to, so far, make these come to home to roost in terms of official environments of accreditation or bordering upon sitting fees for exams and this kind of thing. So a nominal fee for assessment at this subsidiary of Pearson called Pearson View at over 4,000 centers worldwide becomes the new denominator of it. It's not the university, it's the at the level of connection with the individual person, the student, and it's through a private sector company. So immediately, the minute you're talking about open access education, someone has monetized it within months. Okay? So this is what I mean about different forces at work and how open is open and so on, which I'm sure we're talking about. So globally, how does one ascertain an ethical basis to this sort of thing? So that's the challenge I'm proposing again. And of course, sorry about that block on the right. Is that just being viewed? Is that okay? It's not in your way. But you can see the typical course enrollments. Now, on one hand, here's two ways of looking at it. This is for 3 of the most popular massive open online courses, and you would have seen some of these statistics. If we said there's an 82% attrition rate in anything we offer, you'd really be worried. If it's a 90% attrition rate, you might say, in principle, what are we doing wrong? But of course, these kind of have that level of attrition rate on purpose. So it's changing the whole dynamic. And of course, another way of looking at it is to say, if you'd had 7,157 people studying successfully in something in this environment as never before, that's a huge success. It depends on how you look at it. But one of the fascinating questions to ask is, why do people fail to continue in these, and what do they learn on the way through, even if they don't complete? So there's all sorts of research around them. But one can clearly say, and I believe this to be so, it is all about the patterns of learning being tested, evaluated, adduced in, as we call learning analytics, as never before. So if we think when you get a flyby's card, you're being assessed by Coles, imagine how it is in this case. Okay, every time you sign up to a MOOC, every keystroke is being captured. And the data management side of that in terms of Coursera, has anyone actually looked at the Coursera contract? Anyone in the room? It's fascinating reading. If you read the fine print, and it's not that fine and hard to find, I know there's some solicitors and legal academics in the room who do this, you will find that the intellectual property is not retained by the individual academic in many ways, because the data around student behavior is controlled by Coursera and can actually be sold back to the university afterwards. Does that sound a bit like the electronic publishing model we currently have in libraries? You know, where the model is you produce the research, you do a fantastic job of editing, and the refereeing process is out there in the world, largely voluntary, but once it enters into this sort of Taylor and Francis world, money is paid both for it to be handled in a certain way and actually sold back in a certain way to university systems. So the academic is pretty far away individually from control of that, but of course there are advantages as well. I mean, dissemination is one. Anyway, again, sort of ludic battles and different forces taking place. So Adrian Sanier called these the four beyonds. Now Adrian Sanier works for Pearson now, he used to work at Arizona State University. He's one of the vice presidents at E College in Denver, Colorado. So Adrian Sanier called it beyond textbooks, which is clearly an interesting debate. We had this debate even at Monash last week in one room, where people were saying, will it increase readership of e-books in the future? Or in fact, the textbooks as we know them now, even the concept of the text or the set text will disappear. So imagine the two arguments there. One is that if you can articulate the best individual articles and bring them together in a source, in a kind of iBook source, and that doesn't contravene intellectual property or copyright rules, which is a big factor. That's a big factor. Would that mean that the textbook by a single author or four authors, as we now know, would no longer be the case? In other words, have companies like McGraw-Hill and all the others, the science publishers, seen this coming, and they're trying rapidly to escalate what they offer to avoid this kind of serious cliff which they might be facing? I think the answer is they're moving very fast, and some of us who work in the university library area would know more about it than I do. But it's a fascinating, active field right at the front end of what we give to our students. Now, I just used the word give. At the moment, students purchase these books. Someone told me that her niece had spent $1,000 on textbooks last week, starting Monash Medicine. First question I have is that absolutely necessary? Are we over-servicing in the way that we're requiring? I mean, remember what I said before about student poverty. And secondly, what happens at the end of that? A lot of these are used in part, but are they used optimally? So it's a pedagogical question of how we design courseware, how even set readings are used rather than discovering together what they may be. Depending on the offering, it can be very different indeed. So that's why I say, I think Sanders is right to ask the question, what is beyond textbooks? What's happening in the next phase there? Well, we've seen a lot of this. Now, I don't think that's quite right to say beyond bookstores, but beyond some sorts of repositories. A lot of fluid choice. I mean, I love to remind people how the harbingers of doom, where we're talking about, how various category killer bookshops would ruin the market 10 years ago, and they've gone broke. And niche providers who have a strong academic input, the readings of Melbourne, for example, that kind of offering which integrates, say, music and because it's Melbourne coffee and lots of other things, have a different view of what's going on. But have our university, bookshops even started to even react to this? I mean, I had a look recently at the Clayton bookshop, and although it looks quite pretty, I actually don't think we're anywhere in the zone that we need to be in terms of providing what students need. I think it's very much in this kind of factory model. that is way behind what we're seeing in terms of choice and requirement. And of course, beyond learning management systems, there are lots of proprietary ones, and people would be surprised how much this occupies the time of university thinkers, saying which do we go with and what works. There isn't any that's perfect. In fact, one could argue they all have enough baggage attached to them that most academics find it painful. And that's a pity, because they can be liberating in the extreme. But because of the training required to change from one, let's say, in our case, Blackboard to Moodle, and I'm sure other universities are in a similar zone, whether they're using one form or another, any change is seen as an impost on time instead of a liberation. And that's a risk, okay? It's a risk for us. And because very often they're hosted off-site in the cloud or by second bodies, it's who does one blame if it goes wrong too, is the other issue. Who actually picks up responsibility for this? And it's a big issue. It's a big issue. And so you have different camps in the world now being created and different proprietaries. And I know that, for example, Google and Pearson, as we mentioned before, are working together to create what they think should be another free open access learning management system, which is, they think, will be better than all of the current ones. But again, it's become part of the landscape of just what we must have to make the world work. Now, beyond school, I actually am of the view that, and this is contentious, I know, but I'm of the view that it would be fantastic for every tertiary education institution in this country to have a secondary school on the same borders, on the boundary. I just think it's a fabulous way of emphasizing the continuum of education right through from at least year 9 and beyond. Now, there's been experiments, of course. If you look at, say, the Cox Harbour Education Precinct, which has both TAFE and school and university campus, but that's pretty small. And there's, of course, experiments that we're seeing in Melbourne and other places in South Australia, our own John Monash Science School at Clayton, the Nossal School at the Barrett campus. I've got to tell you, for any of you who haven't been involved in this kind of experiment, it's incredibly enlivening, inspiring, and changing the way that educational design and curriculum delivery works. Let me give you an example. So, the John Monash Science School on the screen for you to see has just graduated its first group of students from year 12 after 3 years, and already is going to host the World Science Fair in 2 years' time, and that's with our assistance. Almost all the courseware has been co-designed with Monash Science and Medicine and Education faculty, academics, and others. And now, the National Broadband Network, or NBN Co, as it's called, which has an education stream, has allocated in a grant more than $2 million to the John Monash Science School and the university to develop curricula in interdisciplinary science areas that have never been seen in that way before at the secondary level. So, different forms of astronomy and astrophysics, different forms of nanotechnology. Now, to me, these will find their level, and it may not end up being in year 11. That's just where it starts. But for example, this is a fact, because of enhancement studies and because of the openness now across borders, and we talked about this, and many of these same things could be said to happen internationally with schools in other countries, linking with Australia and China, for instance, ultimately, and other Malaysia and so on. But the point is this: very able students are ready to study at a high level at many different times. And last year, that's great. Last year, the person who taught first year biology at Monash was a year 11 student from this school. And no one knew that, because it's just a student number, and unless they were in groups. But who would have predicted that would be the case? Another example about the way that people can be so incredibly talented, which is what it's all about, is that the Science Olympiads, which are held each year in a different location, they have chemistry, biology, and physics, involve young people of the same age group. Okay? And Australia's taken part in this for something like 40 years. And the training camp for that group takes place at the Clayton campus every January. So those of you who are not present and miss out on this, it's quite an experience to watch what happens. So 70 young people in the ages of about 16 to 18 arrive on the 8th of January. They leave on the 18th after 10 days, and they've done the equivalent of an entire first year offering in physics or chemistry or biology in that 10-day period. Finished it intensively, and the basis upon which they are selected for the Science Olympiads representing this country is that experience. So there's no absolute set period for, that's a whole year course, done intensively, and done in a very different high-touch way, also with very few distractions. Because people have residential accommodation, access to the sporting facilities, and the staff voluntarily in the science faculty give up hours and hours of time to make it happen too. So how does that all draw together then? So if we're saying global engagement, and if you're asking about curriculum design and across borders, then we start to do something quite interesting, because I'm actually arguing the following, that we're seeing models develop that we have never seen before. And a school on an international campus in any network is going to change the way that it works. Let me give you a concrete example. Our ally partner in the UK, Warwick University, has a fantastic mechanism for online learning called International Gateway for Gifted Youth, or IGY, that's what they call it, which is absolutely worldwide. And the country which has the highest number of enrollments is Africa, or the continent that has the highest number of enrollments is Africa. And that is just part of what one does. It hasn't been predicted that this would be the case, and it has naturally emerged in that way. I think it's fabulous that's occurred. It's a bit like the same sort of thing I know William and others have been involved in on our South Africa campus, seeing the potential for the future of people who haven't necessarily had traditional qualifications. So the order that I want to see broken down is the one which says it is only a collective exam result or an equivalent ATAR score, entry score, which is the barrier to entry. There have to be others which come on board. Now, you might say, well, that's contravening everything you said about gifted education before, because all those things are predetermined by exams. But they're not, okay? Because even the John Marr Science School admittedly does have an exam, but it has a huge range of people who apply, and every single one of them is interviewed. Every single one. And they look for the potential, the spark for passion in science, not just a mark or a result. And how many times do we look only for one to the decimal place result as a choice for admission? And yet we know for a fact that universities like MIT, we heard MIT talk, a representative from MIT talking at this very podium 2 years ago, saying that the big difference that they have, and this is not to do with MOOCs, but they might use those as admission aspects in the future too, was saying every student who applies to MIT, and there are about 10,000 who apply the first year and have an interview, yes, they have an interview. And they have an interview around the world close to where they live with an official from the university and a member of the alumni group. Now imagine what one would do. Imagine, first of all, the cost of doing that. Pretty phenomenal. But the care, and it's almost like what I argued at the beginning. You have this amazing concept of the global and of what quality is, but it comes down, in the end, to a personal meeting with 3 people, almost like the meetup groups. You know, that same sort of thing triggers the future. And to me, that's a very ethical response, because it's saying to people, there must be something more to you than just the dossier. Just as there is much more to every course that we offer in terms of our descriptions of it. It's never done justice just by what we have published. And I think a lot of it, you would argue, people would just come to the class and see what it's like and have an experience of that. It might even be more enriched. And very often I hear the frustration of academics saying, what do I do in this world when, you know, it seems that certain classes are favored or compulsory, and one that's an elective that I offer doesn't achieve the same renown. It's difficult, it's frustrating, but we must be able to use these techniques, I think, the very personal, the very emplaced, but also at the same time, the very blended and the very global to achieve our aims. That, I think, is the challenge for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Beyond applause, questions. We have about five minutes for some questions, please, or a few minutes with Leanne and the one putting and we go for a couple of minutes of Edinburgh. Someone like to pose a question, please? Yes.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed all aspects of that talk. I know you ended on the note of the challenge, which is to make it personalised and blended and all of those. I was just wondering whether you could
perhaps go into some more examples. You could give some examples along the way. So I just wondering if you might take the opportunity to do that.
Sure, sure. Well, look, we're not trying to just talk about them in one institution, but we're familiar with those at Marsh because we're close to it. But we have seen, for example, and I think the area of psychology is one I'd like to quote, because that is such a popular discipline worldwide, and yet such an unpopular discipline worldwide too, in terms of assessments. If you see the results on student measurements of satisfaction, psychology does not always do well, and yet it's seen as a gateway discipline for so many other offerings, be they biomedical or scientific and so on, and in practice. So we've given a lot of attention to a blended model in that area. Let me tell you the before and after story, and some of you would be amazed by what's happened. The before story is that we had nearly 1,500 students in a first year offering, code, class, subject, and we call it unit, at Monash, in psychology. And there were 5 repeat lectures, okay, of the same material every week for a smaller group of, say, 300. And you could imagine not only the impact of that on the students, not so lucky if they're the 5th time round, and on the staff who were the same, not so lucky if it's the 5th time round, and maintaining any sort of semblance of freshness. So we actually took that and threw it up in the air and said there must be a better way, and there must be a better way to incorporate global examples of psychology as well as domestic ones, and to use the best of the preparatory work. So the blended model came into play, which is to say, as much as possible, work that was by rote or had to do with memorization or anything else was put outside the class and in advance, but done in a very clever way to do with, online quizzes and simulations and all sorts of aspects. And the classes themselves became much more like lectorials, if you can imagine, but also the dimension of it was changed so that people could ask in real time questions and SMS them, all sorts of technical things that occurred. And most importantly, the staff were involved in redesigning it as a group. So instead of seeing this as a chore which somehow lower ranking, and dare I say, academics were being forced to do, it became an area of teaching where the senior professors in the faculty and in the department wanted to do. And that's the human factor, right? That's the one that, when you have the most senior people saying, could I have a piece of that? I'd love to be part of that process. Something is going on that's correct, right? So the blend there then ended up resulting in a lecture hour being cut completely. Students voted for it as well, and replaced by 2 hours of preparatory work each week that was better, clearly better. Our student evaluation of teaching in unit, which had been at around 3.5 on the Likert scale of 5, went to 4.5 in 12 months actually. And interestingly, the satisfaction of the staff went up as well. So I'm not saying these things are easy, but the whole concept of renovation from the beginning and seeing it as being a process which is very iterative and very cooperative can get there. And now it's starting to make its mark globally in terms of publication in a longitudinal way about the way that this has happened. So in true fashion, the psychologists will use this as a case study with a control group and looking at others and seeing how people learn better. So that's just a very small description, but it gives you some idea of the kind of process one can undertake. Now, one might say that's a lot of work, but it's also now a lot less work. It's done once, for the renovation for a period which is going to last, I think, for a good 5 years. Not content, but approach and methodology. Gives you some indication.
Okay, I think we've got time for just one more question. We have. Otherwise, I'm nervous. Adam, if you were reading the conversation 3 or 4 months ago,
right,
just after the Ernst Young report, you would have thought the whole world was turning over to MOOCs and we're going to swamp. I'm so happy to hear you, suggesting resistance isn't futile. I just wondered if you see any linkages between this and rankings in general.
Oh, sure. Look, can I be honest with you? I think MOOCs as a concept have a lot to offer. Okay? They do as a concept. I'm really fascinated by it. But in the wrong hands, they're a dangerous weapon, in a way, because they could be done very poorly. And imagine if you had a MOOC that was on the practices of online learning and it failed. It gives the whole discipline a bad rap in a quick way too, because it could have 200,000 people all being disappointed at once. So what I'm getting at is the design behind these. I would have a lot fewer of them and a lot better ones. I think we're expanding them too fast, and it's a bit of a club factor. That everybody wants to be in an edX club. or Coursera Club, or the other clubs happening. Now, we haven't opted for a club yet. We might. But if we did, we'd probably only offer 1 or 2 things, I think, and that's it. And they would be things, I'll give you an example very quickly, something which we could not offer any other way, shape, or form. So if you read the Monash Research magazine, I've talked about this with some people in the past, there's an amazing research site in archaeology called Gambang, which is in the Northern Territory. Some of you may be familiar with this. And it's in about 4 hours south of Catherine. Now, this is incredibly sensitive area, and the imagery, the artwork, the whole history of it is fragile, but it's also creating a whole new vision of the world in the deep archaeology. Now, with permission, the Javelin have asked us to look at the possibility of creating something which is a bit like a MOOC about this, but in the context of origins of humankind, which would mean that people wouldn't necessarily have to visit the site to gain some appreciation of its depth and longevity and importance. Now, very careful balance there, because what's the balance between too much appropriation of imagery and enough to give a respectful, dare I say, ethical view. But that kind of thing, if, for example, you looked at South Africa, where we have a campus, and the marvelous museum that's at the University of Witwatersrand, and there's lots of sites in rock art there, and had a comparative offering here, and that was offered to the world free of charge, and the call to action was, if you'd like to donate to this community to help preserve its heritage, the only money that would change hands would be to go to the Javelin. That would, to me, be an ethical MOOC, as opposed to one which is self-congratulatory. Okay? Do you get the difference in how these things could be constructed? I think a lot of them are done for sort of quasi-commercial reasons, like have this taster, and if you like it, then you could pay for the rest of the degree. That's the part which I think isn't really fulfilling its destiny. Okay? For what that's the way I see it.
Okay, folks, unfortunately, we must, not unfortunately, because I know it's going to be just as engaging, but thank you if I could ask you please to...
My name's Jansen. I'm a research and learning coordinator. We have Marion Slawson, the subject librarian, Leanne McCann, who is a learning skills manager, and Lyn Torres, and Lyn's the information research skills manager, and we're all from Monash University Library. The library has a unique role at Monash in that we actually work in partnership with faculty and we talk about curriculum development, and we're helping to embed the types of skills that we're going to talk about today. So we have some learning objectives for today that we hope you come away with. Firstly, discovering the practical and transferable skills and articulating those in many ways through conversation. Leanne and Lyn are going to talk about the theoretical background behind the research skill development framework and how it relates to these globally transferable skills. And then we're going to actually do a hands-on and apply the framework to assessment tasks. So I'm going to hand over to Marion, who's going to run a bit of a reflective beginning of today.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, I might just start by saying that we are, as a workshop, assuming no knowledge about the RST framework. So if you do have some knowledge, that's terrific and you can help your colleagues, but we're starting from a very base level, so I hope that reassures you. So we're going to do a reflective activity. And the purpose of this activity may not be apparent from the get-go, but we will tie it all together and you will understand by the end of this workshop why we did this the way we did. So I'm not going to explain any more. I'm just going to ask you to think about these 2 questions that we have here. I'm just going to ask you to write down some responses. And the questions are, what are some of the most valuable skills you gained from your degree? This is important. For some of you, it might take some thinking about. It might have been a tough some time ago, but I think for most people, the degree is fairly formative. So, and if you've done multiple degrees, just pick one, that's fine. So the most valuable skills you gained from your degree. And then what activities within that degree, within that course of study, helped you to acquire those skills? So if you can just take a few minutes to think about that, and then we'll go around with others. Okay, everybody, now I'm going to call time on that, and I hope people have had a chance to think of some skills and to call out some of them. So anybody want to start by telling me some of the skills they acquired during their degree? Okay, thanks, Sarah. Pick on a table.
Anyone?
Oh no. It looked like Deb was ready to contribute.
All right, I've got written down 3 things. I think development of my voice and ideas.
So I'll just repeat. Development of my voice and ideas. Yep.
The ability to assess academic ideas and question truths.
Ability to develop academic ideas and question truths.
An ability to identify underlying value and belief systems of authors and knowledge processes and outcomes.
Ooh, do you want to say that?
It's the last one. Thank you.
The last one?
Yeah, the last one, please, thanks.
I don't think this is working. Yeah. Ability to identify underlying value and belief systems of authors, knowledge processes and outcomes.
Brilliant, thank you. Lovely higher order skills there. Anybody else got anything different?
Moving to the back. Anything different?
We are research skills.
Research skills, yeah. And did you break that down at all?
Well, just researching for thesis writing.
Yep.
I just sort of library workshops that help me with Internet.
Oh, we love you, thank you.
And then we discussed with the learning a language skill.
Learning a language, it is a skill.
And
yeah.
what I helped with that was some of the teaching methodologies that we employed around that time. And I had a third one, which was I think I learned to negotiate during my degree.
So negotiation, yeah. Okay.
Help with making proposals that
Yeah.
work.
Fantastic, thank you.
Should we move on to activities perhaps that help develop some of these skills?
Yeah, unless anybody wanted to add anything different at this point about the skills they gained.
I'll pick on this table.
I said presenting your own ideas and tutorials.
Yeah,
This is part of the undergrad degree.
Yep, brilliant. Yep. Thank you.
Any others? Working in groups?
Yep.
Okay. Industrial projects?
Industrial projects, yeah.
And experience.
So these are the sorts of things stand out. Anything else?
I'm an international student, so I learned how to develop intercultural communication skills.
Yeah.
And also there is how to engage the people in creative works.
Yeah. Lovely.
Other software program, for example,
Yeah. Yep. Yep. So different sorts of skills. There's your sort of softer skills and your mechanical skills. Brilliant. Anybody want to add anything apart from about particular activities that they experienced at university? No?
Just a little quick one. This is in another country, of course, but learning by doing. For example, learning a foreign language by acting in a play in that language.
Yep.
So it was outside the classroom, but very related to it.
Yep. It's really interesting that no one's mentioning writing an essay. The humdrum stuff. It must be the different experiences that have stayed with you. Thank you very much. We're just going to move on to the second part of this activity now. Sarah's going to...
I like this microphone, so I'm going to talk
Yeah,
here.
good.
Okay, so we've talked and we've shared a little bit around the room. So now I want you to pretend that you're Santa Claus, because he's pretty globally active, I suppose. So you're Santa and you have the ability to give just one skill to all of the students out there, and you have to choose just one that helps them with not only whatever course they're doing, but their professional future. So this is a bit more individual. Think about the skill that's most important to you in your professional career and in your learning, and write that down, and then we'll get a bit of feedback and we'll get a bit of a list going. So the one skill that you decided...
Oh, skill to love others and self.
The difference between learning to know and knowledge.
Inspiration. I have empathy. My brain.
Thank you.
Community leadership.
Valuing others' opinions and also valuing your own opinion.
Sorry, can I just clarify valuing others'
opinions and your own opinion.
Thank you.
Well, this is rather a long-winded one. You can compress it though. Ability to read, assess, critique large volume of material quickly.
Present their point of view with sufficient and relevant evidences.
Sorry, sir, can you translate that for me? Yeah.
Present your point of view with sufficient, relevant evidence.
Thank you.
Employability skills. At the same time, I'm quite interested to involve the university, how to engage with the industry, the partnership between university and industry. Yes, I'm quite interested. For university, there's a partnership that's for university, and for the student, there's employability skills.
Okay, so employability skills. Is there one particular skill that you think makes people employable?
Yeah. Actually, employability skills, which is a big term.
Yeah, it
Under this, there are a lot of finding communication skills.
Communication skills, brilliant, thank you.
Anyone over here?
Think outside the box.
Communication came to our mind immediately. All four of us at the table thought that, or effective communication, and we thought that would encompass writing, speaking, ethical communication, and particularly on social media. We had an anti-procrastination pill. And I'd add being able to synthesise information to that too.
I think we could all do with that all the time.
Synthesize information. Thank you. So, the interesting thing about this is that no matter what our discipline, where we are, what our profession, what we're doing, these are the skills that we want all of our students to take away, and none of them are really discipline specific. I hate to use the word generic, but they pretty much are. And we're going to actually take these and translate them to the framework while you learn a little bit more about the research skill development framework. But these are the kinds of skills that the research skill development framework helps us articulate to students, helps the students identify their own abilities, helps them to develop as they go through the learning process as well. So I'll pass on to Leanne.
We're now going to move into an activity in the tables. We call it our card activity. And what we're doing is really unpacking the skills that you've mentioned here and really go to the micro level. So we're looking at the skills that students need to engage with the content. And that's supported with the RSD framework. So we'll be going through this activity now with you all.
So that activity was just to drill down a little bit deeper into the micro skills that students need to have in order to engage with content. So when we had that first reflective exercise, the skill sets that you were offering were quite broad skill sets that contained quite a few sets of skills within that one statement that you provided us. But by doing this activity, we narrowed it right down to the pointy end. What are the actual skills? We made them explicit. So now we've put on the tables a copy of the RSD framework, or the Research Skill Development Framework, for you to look at. It is quite a small one. We normally have a bigger framework. The Skill Development Framework was created by Dr. John Willison from the University of Adelaide, and it was part of an ALTC research grant that he put this together. And it was all about making skills explicit so that students were aware that they were learning in their discipline a set of skills as well as the content. So what John was trying to do is to bring those things together so the skills were no longer divorced from the content and students were actually able to see what they were learning. This has given an opportunity to redivide assessment tasks and learning activities to make those skills explicit the whole way through. So from the moment you devise a task and you write learning objectives, making the skills explicit as well as the content that students are learning. And then taking those learning objectives and developing an assessment rubric that carries that right through. So those learning objectives are then in the rubric and students can see what skills are required and how they can progress those skills, how they can develop those skills over time so that they're scaffolded. So the RSD is built on two things really. The Australian-New Zealand Information Literacy Standards, which is the column that we have here on the left in the white. So that's the vertical column. And that goes through the logical steps that you would take in order to undertake a research project. I keep fading out. From embarking on inquiry right through to the communication process. And that's what you were doing with that last activity, breaking down those skill sets. So from the facets of inquiry, from A to F, cover that, and behind each one of those conceptual statements sits a set of skills which are particular to your discipline. And this is what is key to the RSD. If you just look at it as it is, you can think it's too generic, it's too flat, you feel that, how am I going to apply this? But if you break down each one of those individual facets, have a look at what skill sets are relevant in your discipline, you've unlocked the RSD. So the card activity we have are quite generic sets, but you could write your own set of skills which are relevant to you. The interesting thing about the ANSL standards being applied is that libraries have had the Australian-New Zealand Information Literacy Standards available since 2004. It's been very hard for the library to articulate to faculty the benefit of using these steps and skills in the curriculum. And I think it's because we were using the language of librarians and we weren't able to really communicate that very clearly. But what John Willison's done is he breathed life into the ANSL standards by overlaying the standards with Bloom's taxonomy. So Leanne's going to talk a little bit about that now.
Okay, the other thing I'd like to say about the Research Skill Development Framework is it's a very flexible conceptual framework. So although it has that grid look, you are not boxed into certain processes as you go through it. As we know, the research process is cyclical and you go up and down that process as you go through research. The other thing that's really important as we talk about this framework is that the way we talk about the framework is that you overlay this framework on what is happening in the curriculum at the moment, because the skills are happening with the content in the curriculum, but often it's implicit. And so the Research Skill Development Framework and unpacking those skills that are working very closely with the discipline content and their professional requirements and the employability requirements, you can really devise some excellent curriculum that makes those skills explicit. And through that card activity, the students, when they're going through curriculum that's been informed by the RSD, actually recognise the skills that they have. So when they become graduates, they really can articulate the kinds of skills that they've got that complements their content. So the other thing about moving on from what Lyn was saying in regard to the facets of inquiry and now the level of autonomy with Bloom's taxonomy, the way that this framework works is that depending on where your curriculum is pitched, whether your students are at level 2, and that means that, for example, level 2 students research at a level of closed inquiry and require some structure and guidance. So you need to work out where your students should be as a point throughout that curriculum or the unit that you're working with. The one thing that's really important to recognise is that whatever your cohort is, wherever there's new knowledge, the students need some structure and guidance. So that's where they come down to this level 1 or the red level area, where as they're going through that research process and they're learning, they actually know the kinds of structures, and they learn the good, appropriate ways of doing things to learn and engage in that content. As they become more familiar and the assessment and the requirements of that curriculum become more advanced, that level of rigour increases as you go along those stages or the levels of autonomy. So a student in honours may be learning a whole new concept, so they get a lot of structure and guidance, but they quickly move up the levels of autonomy. So, that's what we wanted to say about the breadth of impact. I suppose the interesting thing from what we'd like to share with you today is that the expertise that we have in collaboration is librarian information research and curriculum and educational learning skills expertise. And the one thing that's absolutely fantastic is we want to share with you that collaborative expertise, and coupled with the expertise of the discipline academics, has been a really holistic way of working together. The other thing, with the research skill development framework, it doesn't matter what cohort you have, where they are, and in what form you are actually, whatever kind of pedagogy you're using, because this research framework can be overlaid in a number of ways and can be used to develop a number of artefacts. It can be developing, for example, an artefact where you can have a guided reading activity that's based on this research process. And if you have students, for example, who are diligent in attending, but when it comes to look at a journal article, they can't look at it critically, they can't analyse it in the way that you are after. So there's activities where you can structure some kind of guided reading activity where you go through that process of unpacking and critically analysing. And we've had some real success in that, because once the students understand what is required, they can actually build on that through that course and develop on those requirements that are really essential for the students as they're working through the curriculum. So we'd like to share with you this afternoon an activity where you can actually unpack and work on a rubric.
Okay. So with all your feedback, I have to admit, we had an epic fail and it was fantastic. The document didn't save, so it actually put our minds to the test, and we had to paraphrase others' ideas as best as we could. Sorry, I'll just open this file here so you can have a look at what we've actually done with your feedback. So on the left, we have the facets that are down the left-hand side of the research skill development framework. We have tried to remember and paraphrase the feedback that we've just got. We were going to cut and paste, but that's okay. I think we've done a pretty good job. If you see that you gave some feedback that we didn't remember very well, we do apologise, but perhaps it's good for you to try and slot it into to the relevant facet as a skill that's one of those globally effective skills. Interestingly, I have to add then to that, memory is probably something that helps me, and I might stick that in the synthesize and apply. If I go back to our presentation, we thought it might be helpful to show two different contexts in which we've worked with faculties to apply the framework to the curriculum, and some outcomes of that. And then after that, we're going to work on an assessment task, which, funnily enough, is an essay task, but it's a first year essay just to get our head around it. and hopefully be able to do, you know, what some of the things that we've been applying at Monash. So I'm going to talk to you firstly about a full course application of the RSD for the Master of Clinical Embryology, which is a very unique and prestigious course at Monash. It's unique in the whole of the Southern Hemisphere, and there's only a couple of similar courses over in the UK running. What it actually is a course to teach embryologists how to be embryologists, and then they go off and work as professionals in IVF labs and make babies around the world. It's very highly practical, and it's working with cutting edge technology equipment. All of the speakers for that course are usually guest speakers, people right at the top of their game, working in the field and researching in the field. There are no set texts, and the students really have to draw from the latest research. That is the expectation, and they have to think about future research that can go on. So that's the way that the course is run. There is a very competitive job market, and in this course, most of the students get a job in this profession the following year, across the world, I have to say. Some of the issues that the students communicated there's a high international student intake, and these are usually clinicians coming into the course from everywhere. And some of the issues that they communicated to the course coordinator were, firstly, that they had essentially come from rote learning pedagogies, and they were finding it very difficult to learn in the way they were expected to learn and produce the things they were expected to produce. They were hoping for a set text, they were hoping to be able to digest that and sit a multi-choice exam and that sort of thing, and it wasn't quite what they had expected. That generated a lot of queries then, clarifying what is required, how do I do it, seeking direction on how to improve marks. They always wanted to get the best marks, and they couldn't understand why their marks weren't as good as they had hoped. The staff also were very time poor because they're fantastic educators. They had an open door policy. They were constantly clarifying all the expectations for the students. And because there were a lot of guest lecturers, there was a lot of casual sessional lecturers that were also marking assignments. It was very difficult to get the same expectations across a range of lecturers, so marks had to be modulated somewhat. So we worked with the RSD framework to try and redevelop the curriculum to help the students and help the staff. And what we found was that it was very clear the knowledge that they wanted to impart on the students, and it was very clear that the practical side, the technical skills, the lab skills that they wanted to teach. But the bit that they missed out on down the bottom was the research skills, which was what they were assessing as part of the whole thing. And these were the bits that they found lacking. So they clarified the starting point, what do we have here, and what sort of skills are coming in, and the desired endpoint for all of those things. And once we had that picture, we then used the research skill development framework to elucidate very clearly all those skills and the level of attainment for a postgrad course. And then the job was to make that extremely clear to the students so they knew what skills they were meant to be developing as well. The learning objectives were reviewed and revised, and we staggered skill development across the units. We've explicitly stated learning objectives for all of those things, practical knowledge and research skills. Then some learning activities were embedded to develop those skills throughout the course of the year. And in terms of assessment tasks, we actually sort of staggered those or stepped those as well. So you can see here there's a critical analysis, so understanding how to deeply critique a research paper, moving to a critical comparison, comparing to another research paper, then moving to an annotated bibliography and getting multiple comparisons going, and then extending that up into a literature review. So the students had that learning as they went. At the end of the year, they produced a whole minor project, and the level last year was phenomenal compared to the level the year before. So the outcomes, there was a common understanding for the students and the staff about all of the expectations, that hence fewer queries and a little bit more time for staff. Because of the use of assessment rubrics that had clearly stated each set level, there was more consistency in the marking, which again created a little bit more time for the academics because they didn't have to modulate and painstakingly go through everything and remark, which was nice. There was, anecdotally, a higher standard of research skill attained by the end of the course. And comparing papers was just one easy way to do that. Very favourable unit evaluations for the whole course. And the teachers were still time poor because that's just half of the course. All the changes required a lot of effort and a lot of time, but the course coordinator did say that it was really, really worth it. She said she's looking forward to a smooth ride now that the changes have been implemented and successfully implemented. So she's happy going forward. Next context. Enter Marion.
Thank you, Sarah. So, now for something completely different. I'm going to talk about the RSD framework and how it was applied within just one particular unit. So, this is an arts unit, and as you probably know, there is no common core in arts. So it's a lot harder to do a whole curriculum redevelopment, but you can work within units and streams. So this is a view of Italy. There's a few of those in there just to keep your minds fantasising about global engagement. I'll go. So just a little bit about the unit Italy on Film. It has a focus on Italian history and culture as seen through post-war film, and it looks at cultural contexts of those films and covers issues such as the wartime, resistance, fascism and migration post-war. And it does this through a critical analysis of films, so the students are learning a bit about history and culture as well as how to critique and analyse films, looking at specific genres and styles of films. Just a bit about the unit and why it's part of a global engagement context. It's taught as an intensive at the Monash Prato campus. And the campus is about 25 kilometres northwest of Florence in the beautiful region of Tuscany. It's offered at second and third year levels, and it's open to students outside of the Faculty of Arts because it's part of the Monash Passport program. And so because of this, there are no prerequisites for this unit. And because there's no prerequisites, we cannot assume anything. So we can't assume that the skills have an understanding of what the basic task requirements are. We can't assume that they know how to locate appropriate scholarly information. We can't assume that they know how to evaluate and analyse a film and film criticism. We can't even assume that they know how to organise and synthesise information according to an arts standard. And we particularly can't assume that they can communicate using discipline conventions. So just a little bit from the lecturer's perspective, this is a lecturer who's really passionate about Italy, about Italian film, and about teaching. However, she did think that there were some improvements to be made. I've written there that the student evaluations were already very good and consistently very good, but being a passionate lecturer, she felt that there was still room for some improvement in these particular areas that I've documented here. So they are articulating and documenting the task requirements, the different task requirements for second and third year students. I said before it was offered at both levels. The marking structure, and also providing useful feedback to the students. The other thing is, because it's taught as an intensive, the students really need a lot of information in advance of actually embarking on to Italy. They need to do some work before the unit actually starts. So the lecturer was introduced to the framework at an event run by Monash, and quickly grasped that it would be a useful tool to help her remedy some of these problems above. And she also recognised that library staff had skills that were complementary to her own as a researcher and administrator, and she felt that it would be a really good collaboration. So she worked with a few of the library staff, and there were lots of conversations with the lecturer about the unit and about what the students were learning, and it very quickly became clear that there was a lot of implicit information in her head that she just hadn't articulated and documented as part of the course materials. So she used to talk a lot to the students about what was expected of them and really guide them through it. It just wasn't actually documented as part of the course curriculum. So we used the RSD framework to identify the expected performance levels. So where should the second years be sitting, where should the third years be sitting in terms of each of the research skills, and which skills do you expect the students to demonstrate are not currently stated explicitly in your assessment tasks. And we also used an existing rubric in the handbook as a starting point to help her think about how it might be possible to create rubrics that were appropriate to her unit. So I don't know if you know about the handbook, but there is a great deal of material on the RSD framework website, which we'll probably talk about a bit later. So as a result of the collaboration, we developed RSD-informed marking rubrics for all 3 assessment tasks. As you can see, there's 3 quite different assessment tasks, and we also revised the assessment instructions to clarify the requirements and emphasise the key skills. So I'm just going to quickly show you what that looked like. Okay, so this is the assessment instructions before for the major research essay. I've circled the instructions. That's it. The rest of the documented material is just the question options. It doesn't even say that the students only need to answer one question. She would have said all this. I'm not trying to denigrate the lecturer. She would have made it quite clear when she was talking to them about the assessment, but it's not actually documented. So we just added in some clarity. Choose one question. This is what it's worth. This is how long it should be. And these are the main criteria for marking. It also refers the students to the assessment rubric for more detail about what's actually required for each of those broad criteria that are listed there. So this is the rubric that was used before for this unit. So you can see she had a clear idea of the key skills, and she also obviously wanted to grade the students, but there's nothing documented about how to actually demonstrate those criteria that are listed there. And so the rubric we developed afterwards, you can see is really similar. There's a gradient of student performance. The marking criteria were more clearly defined and expanded, and you can see at each level we've put in explicit requirements. So, so there's just a lot more detail there about how the students can be sure that they're performing at the level that they want to perform at, or at least what to try, what to aim for. And they also know what the bare minimum is as well. Okay, so just the feedback from students and lecturers, really pleased to have clear assessment instructions and marking rubrics and well in advance of the actual class time. The marking process was much more transparent and efficient, and the feedback was really clear and constructive. And the student evaluation surveys, I mentioned before that they were already very good. They did show improvement in three key areas, and significant improvement as well. The 3 that are listed there. And I'll just wrap that up, I think. And we're going to hand over to Sarah, and we're going to start on our final activity.
So that description segues very nicely into what we're about to do. This is a strategic management essay. It's a first year essay, so bear in mind it's for first year students. On your table, you have A3 piece of paper. It is pretty much an empty research skill development framework. So if you read the instructions here, which is what's provided to students, what we're asking you to do as groups at the table is to think about how you would describe the skills that they need to complete this assignment task, and at what level would you expect them to perform at first year by using the framework, work out which level you would expect students to perform at first year, and then articulate that in clear language for students into this document.
Sorry, I'm just going to bring the focus back again. We're running out of time. So what I've done is put something on your table which you can refer to shortly. But what I want to do is go through the facets and hear from each of the groups for whom I gave that facet what they came up with. And while you're listening, have a look at what was actually provided to the students in the rubric. All the time being mindful that there is no right or wrong. It's up to your interpretation as the assessor. This is what this particular assessor was looking for. And things might be in different places than you pictured them, but that's okay too, because it's a framework. There is no set, stick it in the right box. It's a framework and it's the way you interpret it. Alright, so the group that was we'll just go straight through the HD. The group that was doing embark on the inquiry and determine the need for knowledge. Which table was that? That table? Yeah. Okay. And so, what did you have as an accessible component of that?
We haven't got so far to the high distinction because we got into
Okay.
discussion of the past.
Let's do the past. Okay.
All right. With the past, we thought it's understanding the question and parts of the questions.
Right.
Yeah. Very good. And probably you used to have like 6 references there. Probably parts of them.
Oh,
all
I don't know where we went. Sorry. There.
Yeah. Maybe you come up with not 6, but less than 6.
Okay. So all understanding all the instructions and actually carrying out the task.
Yeah.
Right. And you can see here it's quite different. It's the concepts and issues were identified in a limited capacity. So it's just different interpretation, but that's fine. That's what they were looking at. So find needed information. Who was that? Which table? Over there? Okay. So what did you have?
That would be tricky because number 6 had been given. So just with that limitation, we sort of said, well, basically depends on which 6 you choose. So a pass would be, that identify these 6 relevant references that has some relevance to the question, and at a higher distinction would be identifying more sophisticated sources at a higher level that have good coverage of all the dimensions of the question and that represent diverse perspectives that would enable you to do a critical analysis.
Excellent.
I don't know how you phrase that in 5 words or less.
I know, that's the thing. It's hard to write it clearly so the students understand. But that's excellent. As you can see in the past category, relevance was used for suitability and relevance of the readings and their arguments. So it was the same kind of thing. Interestingly, this rubric gave the students a little bit more information on how to get a high distinction, which is helpful for them to read the rubric while they're doing the assignment, because it says broad range of appropriate readings and some independently sourced material used, which was not in the instructions. So, it's, when you're thinking about the way you like to mark it, it's funny how sometimes your marking can veer off a little from what you've actually told the students to do. All right, critically evaluate information. Who's on that one? Down there? Yeah? I don't mind whichever, pass or high distinction.
At pass level, I think we thought they would have shown that they've done the reading or most of the reading and made some attempt at looking at it, comparing it or identifying it or summarising it in some way at pass level. So those 6 readings, and they might have covered the whole field of them all, but they might have shown that they've done some of the reading and understood most of it, hopefully.
Yep, no, that's great, and that was pretty much what was here for the pass level as well. Organise information?
Sarah.
Oh, do we have an HD?
What did you do for HD and reading?
HD, we put some additional information from articles and result of research, that demonstrate added depth of understanding of strategies, complexity and contextuality in every domain.
Excellent. Right, organised information was very hard. So that's this table here.
So in the past we had that they showed a coherent argument students, which funnily enough in a GPA was high level. And in the hyper section we decided that we should show a lot more that they referenced perfectly, that their evidence was strong, so the argument was well supported and sound, and that they had picked up the two approaches
Yeah. So yeah, coherent argument was your past level, and you're right, they were hoping that the argument was there in some form. Attempt at an argument, but a little bit incoherent. So that's interesting. Okay. Analyse, apply and synthesise new knowledge, I think, was over at the synthesizer side of the table. They got sidetracked.
We got sidetracked and we're talking about other things. But what I was sort of thinking in terms of maybe some more descriptors or clarifying what the student would need at that synthesis level, when I have a look at the rubric that you've handed out, I'd like to see more reference to actually what's in the essay question. So at the high distinction level, talking about maybe a range of the strategies that the student should be addressing, and whether or not they've used appropriate examples as opposed to together in sort of insightful way. So the descriptors here, although descriptive, they're a little bit generic, and if you tie them more closely to the essay question, I think it also gives the students more indication of what they're required to do.
Sure, and that's great feedback. Thank you.
Thanks.
Sidetracked? No, that's fabulous. Okay, and finally, communicate was down here at this table. Communicate knowledge with ethical, social and cultural awareness came down to, yeah?
For the past one, we think that the students have used basic language with few grammatical errors, maybe spelling errors also, and would have used fewer academic references, maybe not all 6. And for the high distinction one, they would have used excellent, they would have showed excellent writing skills with the essay with a clear introduction, body and conclusion. The ideas would be clear and concise, and they would have used all academic references and would have acknowledged all the sources, like in the bibliography.
Okay, and the interesting thing is that some things had also been stated in different categories, and that wasn't just for you, it was for other tables as well. And that's fine, because when you come to do your rubrics, you put things in the spaces that you believe they fit, and they don't get repeated in different sections. I would like to come back to this table though, not to pick on you, but because I know that you addressed it. And that was, they finished conceptualising where their pass and HD were relatively quickly, and then turned over the back and started to really ponder what's the middle ground. How do we tell them it didn't quite make the high distinction, but it's much better than pass? And I wonder whether we could get a little bit of feedback on some of the things you were discussing there. Because the middle ground is the hard bit.
No, that was critical in this case, but we thought the middle ground might be just distinctions that we had to, with your help, then have to explain that it was either they had good evidence but weren't coherent, or they were coherent but didn't provide, we had to actually go that extra mile.
Yes.
And it was difficult. We didn't quite nail it at the end.
Practice. And practice makes perfect. It's very, very difficult, but it's necessary. At least one extra category is necessary so that you can show students where they're sitting in the whole scale, where they do well, but also where they need work. And it's not always just a pass or a high distinction, so they need to know even in the middle where they're falling down to, so that they can work on that and get the high distinctions if they want them. So that wraps up the session. In essence, what we wanted to say again and again is that it's a framework, that what you decide is relevant for each of those categories is fine, so long as you can articulate that very clearly to the students and they can understand what it is that you're expecting, pass, middle, and perhaps a higher mark. But sometimes for some assignments or assessments, you're not looking at developing all of those skills. So you may not want to use all of these facets in your rubric. You may want to start at critically evaluate and move your way down and communicate that to us, and that's fine too. At least you're making clear to the students what this task is aiming to develop and what you're expecting from them. And again, although you've got the rainbow coloured lines for each level of attainment, you might not expect students, you might not expect students to be all down one level. They might be at different levels, and that again is up to you, where you're expecting them to be performing for the different facets. And as you introduce a new assessment task or a new task altogether, perhaps students might fall back a bit in their skill level because it's a new task, and they might have got really used to doing one task, but this is a new task, and they have to go back to, perhaps a more closed inquiry or whatever. So, they don't always push up the scale as you work your way through the year. Are there any questions that anyone has for any of it?
So one problem is, and it's probably very common, what happens when you teach so well based on the RSU, and it's going to be a problem for teaching academic, and everyone is getting distinction or doing distinction level work, high distinction level work.
Okay, so did everyone get the question? The question was, if you're teaching it all so well, that students are all getting distinction level or high distinction level work, that, it was stated that that's a problem. Because you don't have the bell curve in your marks and you have to stand up there and address the academic board and explain, and I understand that. Okay, look, I think it's a good thing that they're getting good marks, but perhaps give them something new and challenging and very, very different, and set them back a bit and make them think again and start again. You have it? Yes.
Actually, it's sort of in response to what Matthew said. I think that when we're using the RSU framework and keeping that in mind, that it would be a challenge if, like, all 30 students in my class are almost in the high distinction range, and I will have to justify. I think we have to, we as educators have to also make it clear through our departments and our faculties that what we're doing with this framework is we're aiding them to learn. We're not punishing them, we're not there to bring them down, we're actually working to their benefit. And we have to have a mind change right to wherever the academic board sits. And so, if that's where we are, and if we are committed to aiding so that people improve and enhance, we can't blame it on a beautiful framework. We've got to go somewhere else for that. That's important to keep in mind. And the other thing I wanted to say is you've stressed this a number of times in your presentation today, is a point I think that we've made throughout the morning as well, is that every discipline will have its distinct place, its context, and I'm one that usually advocates no best practice for every discipline. It's a creative solution per discipline, and only the lecturer, the discipline, and the learners will know how to arrive at that place within the context. There are some disciplines that might require best practice and it's a matter of life and death, but in other cases where it's not a life and death issue, let's give it some space.
really makes sense.
Definitely, and on that, this is one tool in the toolbox for teachers. It's not the only tool. It's one tool that can help in the process. Sorry?
Can I just say one final thing? You all have curriculum that is aligned with the Australian Qualifications Framework, which we thought about as an aspirational tool, an aspirational framework where the students will be able to do whatever at the end of their course. We look at the RSD as helping them get there. So it's overlaying what you do, it's not throwing out what you do and making that implicit skills within the curriculum explicit. And hopefully they're very creative and they come up with all sorts of blue sky.